Tonight is a calm, slow story from Japan about a boy whose ghost stories could make an entire school fall quiet. He was 12, bespectacled, gentle, and he always began with the same careful phrase before every story he ever told. That phrase, he once explained, was a kind of protection, keeping the fear his listeners felt from becoming something heavier. Then one autumn he returned changed and told a story about a shrine, a lid, and a darkness quietly opening. Listen for the small phrase he always said first, and for the one evening he did not say it. Close your eyes now. Let the quiet settle around you, and let the story carry you gently all the way to sleep. Somewhere in the slow accumulation of memory that follows a childhood, there are faces that remain entirely clear and faces that soften and fade to almost nothing. And for Kenji, now many years removed from that elementary school in a small Japanese town, the face that has never once faded belongs to a boy named Haruto. Haruto wore glasses, round ones slightly too wide for his face, and they were always sliding a little too far down his nose so that every few minutes he would push them back up with one precise forefinger, and that gesture, unhurried and habitual, and somehow deeply his own, was perhaps the most characteristic thing about him. He was slender and a little small for his age, and he spent more time in the school library than any other student Kenji would ever know in his life. Not visiting it, not passing through it on the way to something else, but living in it, the way you live in a room that has shaped itself around you. Mystery novels were his love, the long, slow-burning kind, with careful middles and late revelations. And he could tell you, without any performance of expertise, which shelf held the ones worth reading, which authors had earned their endings, and which paperbacks have been handled so many times the spines had softened to cloth. None of this, on its own, sounds unusual, and perhaps it was not. There is always, in every school, one such child, the quiet reader with glasses and a fondness for shelves, the one who seems to have arrived from some slightly different arrangement of the world and is making the best of his time in this one. What was unusual about Haruto? What made him, in the memory of everyone who attended that school in those years, entirely and irreducibly singular, was something else, something Kenji has spent 20 years trying to describe to people who were not there, and which he has never quite managed to capture in words that feel adequate. Haruto could tell horror stories like no one any of them had ever heard, and every story he told was his own, not borrowed from a cousin, not half remembered from late-night television, not a legend that had been passed hand to hand through the playground until its edges were worn smooth, but his own entirely, from the first sentence to the strange and deliberately unfinished end. This was the first thing he always said before every single story, without exception, and after a while the words became a kind of signal, a hush note, a thing that arrived before the story and prepared the room for it. He would say, "This is a story I made up, but..." And then he would push his glasses up his nose, and then the room would go quiet. The quiet is what Kenji remembers most, or rather the particular quality of it. The way it was different from the ordinary classroom quiet that arrives when a teacher asks for attention, which is always a compliance quiet, slightly reluctant, the silence of people choosing to stop talking rather than finding that talking has simply ceased. This was a different thing entirely, something that happened underneath the level of decision, the way a library goes quiet, not because anyone has been told to, but because the books themselves seem to ask it of you the moment you walk in. Children who had been passing folded notes would put them down mid-sentence, without noticing they had done so, and children who had been angled toward the window would turn away from it without remembering why. And there was Haruto, at the center of this quiet he had made without appearing to try, speaking in a voice that never rose above the level of ordinary conversation. Kenji used to watch the room when Haruto talked, which was perhaps unusual. Most people watched Haruto, but Kenji was more interested in the effect than the source. The way you were sometimes more moved by watching a candle light other candles than by the first flame itself. Every face in that room, regardless of the child it belonged to, would settle into the same expression. Not frightened, not excited, but concentrated, focused inward on some private screen where the story was being assembled in real time. Kenji sat next to Haruto for most of 5th grade, an accident of alphabetical seating that felt, looking back, like a small, unearned piece of luck. And because of that proximity, he came to know the quieter side of Haruto that most of the school only glimpsed from the outside. In the margins of the school day, the 10 minutes after lunch when most of the others had gone to the yard, the 5 minutes before the afternoon bell when the classroom was half empty, Haruto would sometimes read and Kenji would stay nearby, and occasionally Haruto would speak in his low and careful way about the book he was currently inside. He was generous with recommendations in a way that carried no agenda and required no reciprocity. He would simply mention that there was something on the 3rd shelf of the mystery section that Kenji might find worth his time, and then he would go back to his own reading, and that would be the end of it. Kenji would go and find the book, and he would almost always like it, because Haruto's sense of what was worth reading had a quiet accuracy that Kenji came to trust more than almost any other guidance he received in those years. They were friends in the way that certain children are friends, not in the said, performed way, not the kind that requires public confirmation and regular acts of loyalty, but in the smaller and more durable way, which is to say that each was genuinely glad of the other's presence, and neither required the other to be anything other than what he already was. Haruto, for his part, seemed to find Kenji's company comfortable in some specific way, and this was not nothing. Haruto was selective, not coldly or deliberately, but simply as a matter of temperament. The way a certain kind of plant grows only in certain soils without making any declaration about the soils it will not grow in. By the middle of 5th grade, Kenji understood that to be among the 2 or 3 people Haruto was genuinely easy with was to be trusted with something that the rest of the school only witnessed at a distance. On those afternoons when Haruto would settle into his chair and say those 8 quiet words, and the room would change. Because what most of the school had, what everyone had, the moment Haruto opened his mouth in that particular way, was the experience of being in the room. And being in the room was enough, quite enough, to make the nickname make sense. The nickname was the Great, full title, Ghost Story Master Grade, or something close to that, which the older students delivered with the particular solemnity that children reserve for things they are not entirely joking about. And in ordinary conversation, in the corridors and the lower stairwells and the corners of the library, it was simply the great, spoken without irony and without any need to explain who was meant. He was not the tallest, not the most athletic, not the child who organized the yard or established the informal laws of the playground. He was none of those things, and he had no interest in any of them. But the school had, collectively and without any formal meeting on the subject, decided that Haruto was more worth listening to than almost anyone else it contained, including the teachers, which was the detail that stayed with Kenji longest. Not more respected in any official or measurable sense. Not higher marks, not more authority, not a better attendance record, but more worth sitting still for, more worth the effort of silence, more worth the particular discipline of paying attention across the whole length of the thing without being told you had to. Kenji remembers hearing, second or third hand, that a teacher in one of the upper classrooms had been partway through an anecdote, and one of her students had raised a hand and asked, gently, whether the story was as good as the greats, and the teacher, a woman known for maintaining a fairly strict dignity, had paused, considered honestly, and then admitted that probably it was not. He was 11 years old, with glasses that slid down his nose and a stack of mystery novels under his arm, and he had earned the sincere and unforced respect of the adults in the building, not for anything the school officially valued or had a grade for, but for the particular and unnamed quality of the thing he carried around inside him. And still, all through 5th grade and into 6th, nobody bothered him. Not the older boys who organized the schoolyard by unspoken territorial law and found occasion to make most of the quieter students understand their position. Not anyone, not once. They left him alone not with the indifference of simply failing to notice him, but with something closer to a considered and collective decision, which children are capable of making even if they could not have articulated it. You do not disturb the person who holds the thing you want, and what Haruto held was the stories, and the stories were wanted by everyone. The stories spread through the school the way genuinely desired things spread. Not pushed, not circulated by anyone with an interest in their own reputation, but moving on their own, room by room, the way a particular smell moves through a building until it is simply everywhere and no one can say how it got there. By winter of 5th grade, horror stories had become the school's primary and formal currency. With competitions appearing at lunchtime, clusters of children gathered on the cold steps to hear each other's best efforts, and a general seriousness about the business of being frightened that the teachers observed with a certain wariness. Other children brought stories too, borrowed ones, inherited ones, legends that had traveled from older brothers in late-night radio programs and the anthology paperbacks that circulated the upper grades. And some of those were very good, Kenji thought, told by children who had a real gift for performance. But there was a quality the borrowed stories always carried. Even the best ones, a quality of having been somewhere before, of edges already worn smooth by many mouths and many tellings. And it was the absence of that quality in Haruto's stories that made the difference feel so large. Haruto's stories felt new in the particular way that new means still living, not unfamiliar exactly, but present immediate, as though they were happening somewhere just out of sight, just behind a corner you hadn't turned yet, in a house just like one you had walked past that morning on the way to school without giving it a second look. The horror boom grew over the course of that year, stranger around the edges. Spirit board games appeared in certain classrooms during break times. Fortune-telling became a serious preoccupation among the older girls, and there were weeks when small groups of children were staying out past dark, visiting the disused buildings at the edge of the town, which they would not do in the ordinary run of a school year. Parents called the school, as parents do when something they cannot quite name starts attaching itself to their children's after-school hours. And the teachers called meetings, and eventually the boom settled into something quieter and more manageable. The way childhood enthusiasms tend to when adults apply the steady pressure of concern. But Haruto's stories were never the thing the parents were calling about. And the teachers seemed to understand this without needing it explained to them, because Haruto's stories did not incite children to do anything in particular. They incited them to sit very still in a room and listen, and then afterward to talk, thoughtfully and with some investment, about what might have been behind the ending. The endings were another thing Kenji noticed. The way they never quite closed, never arrived at the comfortable full stop that most ghost stories aim for, but instead stopped at a moment when the feeling was still full, leaving the listener with the particular unease of a question that had been carefully posed and then deliberately left unanswered. Some children found this frustrating and said so. And Haruto would hear their frustration with the same even attention he gave everything, and nod slightly, and not change a word of any story he had told. The story was finished, he would say, in a tone that was neither defensive nor dismissive, but simply factual, the way someone states that a season has ended. And that was all he would offer on the subject. Kenji thinks now, with the benefit of many years, that the open endings were deliberate, that Haruto understood at 10 or 11 years old something about the mechanics of feeling that most writers spend entire careers working out, which is that what the mind is left to supply for itself is always more powerful than what is handed, and that the space after the story belongs to the listener. He left the space empty, and each listener's imagination filled it with whatever that particular person most needed to be afraid of, and the filling was always perfect, always precisely calibrated, because it came from the person themselves and could not miss. There was one other quality that Kenji has come to think was important, though he did not consciously register it at the time. It was the fact that Haruto never, in all those years, claimed to have personally experienced anything. This sounds like a simple absence, but it was not simple in the context of that school, in those years, when the informal currency of the supernatural was the first-person account, when children competed gently and constantly in the unstated marketplace of who had heard something, who had felt the cold in a particular building, who had dreamed a dream that proved, somehow, that the world was wider than it appeared. Haruto never entered that marketplace and never seemed to notice its existence. He never mentioned a spirit he had encountered, or a building that had felt wrong to him, or a night when something had happened in his house that he could not account for by ordinary means. He said every single time that this was a story he had made up, and then he told the story, and that was all he offered. Kenji has wondered at various points in his life whether this restraint was strategic, whether some quiet, bookish part of Haruto understood that the first-person supernatural claim was a shortcut that cheapened the very thing it was meant to support, that it asked the listener to do the believing rather than the feeling, or whether it was simply honest, because Haruto was honest consistently and completely honest, in the specific way of people who have simply never found any use for. The alternative. Either explanation leads to the same place, which is this. Haruto's stories were offered as fiction, plainly labeled as fiction, and they arrived with no demand that anyone believe them. And yet they settled into the memory with more weight and texture and lingering unease than all the borrowed true accounts combined. And they stayed there longer. And they found the particular corner of the mind where things are kept that feel realer than the room you are currently sitting in. The Great, they called him, and the name fit the way names rarely fit. Not as an affectionate exaggeration, not as a joke that had hardened into convention, but as an accurate description of a thing that was genuinely greater, and for which no smaller word quite served. Kenji is aware, thinking about it now, that the word genius carries more brightness and more weight than an 11-year-old in a school library probably deserves, and yet he has tried smaller words over the years, and none of them have been right. Gifted sounds like something a parent says at a conference to extract better resources from a school system, and talented sounds like something a teacher writes on a report to satisfy an administrative requirement. And exceptional is technically accurate, but misses the specific quality Kenji is trying to name, which is the quality of a person doing something that no instruction could have taught them and no practice fully explains. Haruto told stories the way a river moves, not because anything external requires it, not because he had been arranged to do it, but because telling was simply what he did, what the whole shape of him was oriented toward, and the river does not need to be asked to move. In those years, in that library, in a low late afternoon light that came in at an angle through the tall windows and turned the dust in the air briefly visible before the dark arrived, in that specific light, with the smell of old paper and wooden floors and the faint chalk residue that lived in the fabric of the building. Kenji was aware, in the way a child can be aware of something before he has the language for it, that he was in the presence of something he would not encounter. Again, something that did not come along in every classroom or every school year, or perhaps every generation in a town of that size, something that had arrived without announcement and would stay for as long as it stayed, and would then be gone. The library shelves lined the wall behind where Haruto usually sat, and sometimes Kenji would look at them while Haruto was talking and think about how many of those books had shaped him, how all that reading had been taken in and transformed into something else entirely, something that could not be found in any of the individual books, but had emerged somehow from the space between all of them. He would watch Haruto's face in the low light, the glasses catching a small reflection of the window, the expression calm and interior, the voice unhurried and even, and he would feel a complicated thing that he did not have a name for yet. Not quite envy, not quite awe, not quite the straightforward happiness of friendship, but some alloy of all three, with a quiet edge of something he would later recognize as the early form of loss. The awareness, that is, that the thing you are in the middle of is also already receding, that you are living it and losing it at once. And the light in the room is already the light of a memory, even as you sit inside it. This is a story I made up, but Haruto would say, and the room would settle, and the dust would hang visible in the angled light. And for the length of the telling, the ordinary world would simply wait at a polite distance, and no one would think to call it back. The great, someone whispered once on a cold afternoon walking home from school, and the word went from that mouth to the next and traveled the full length of the school's memory until it was the only name that mattered. Kenji, sitting nearby in the library with a book he was not quite reading, watching Haruto push his glasses up and begin, would feel something move through him that he has spent a long time trying to name a kind of quiet gratitude, or perhaps the early form of what gratitude becomes when you understand in retrospect how seldom the thing you were given actually exists. That was Haruto in those years before everything else. The bespectacled boy in the corner of the library, with his mystery novels and his stories, and his particular and unrepeatable gift for making a room go still. The great in the late afternoon light, pushing his glasses up his nose, saying those 8 quiet words that meant the story was about to begin. And for now, that is where we leave him, in that light, in that library, at the beginning, before anything that would later matter had yet begun to matter. The room is quiet, and the dust is in the air, and Haruto is about to speak, and perhaps that for tonight is enough. Let that moment rest where it fell, quiet and complete, like the last note of song that has no need to resolve. We stay with them a little longer, here in the same still night, the same soft air moving unhurried through the same small hours. There is no rush. If you need to breathe slowly now, please do. The story will wait, patient as the dark itself. The night is long and unhurried, and what comes next rises from the same quiet ground, the same unfolding, one thread drawing itself forward with the gentleness of water finding its way. We go on together, in a small school on a quiet residential street, in a 5th grade classroom where the afternoon light came in low through the western windows. A boy named Haruto had, over the course of several weeks, managed to set something moving through the whole school that no adult had yet noticed was moving. It had started with ghost stories, Haruto's ghost stories, specifically, which were different from other children's ghost stories in ways that were difficult to explain, but plainly felt, the way certain things are felt before they are understood. From the ghost stories, it had grown into something larger. Seances conducted in the corner of the classroom with a coin and a piece of paper, fortune-telling in the stairwells, and after-school expeditions to places that seemed to carry, in the low autumn light, a weight those same places did not carry in the middle of the day. Kenji had been there from the beginning, sitting 2 rows over from Haruto near the windows, and what he remembered most clearly, years later, was not the strangeness of those particular months, but the feeling that accompanied them. The feeling of a school full of children who have agreed, silently and together, that the world is larger and stranger than their daily schedules have accounted for. It had begun quietly, as most things begin, one afternoon when the teacher had stepped out, and someone had said, as someone always did, "Shall we hear one?" and Haruto had adjusted his glasses with one careful finger and considered the request with the serious and unhurried manner of someone for whom care was simply the natural approach to anything worth doing at all. The room settled in the way it always settled when Haruto agreed. Not with any noise or ceremony. Simply chairs turning, bags shifting aside, someone who had been nearly at the door pausing and then very naturally not leaving, as though they had never intended to. What Kenji noticed, watching from his own seat, was that nothing about Haruto's stories ever reached out or grabbed you. There was nothing in the voice that pushed, nothing that insisted on being noticed, and the effect arrived not against the quiet, but somehow through it, entering through the stillness the way cold enters through a window that is only slightly open. The stories themselves were precise in a way that most stories were not. Not dramatic, not elaborated beyond what the thing required, but specific, full of the kind of particular detail that seems incidental until it doesn't. The exact sound a door makes when it has always stood open and one morning stands closed. The particular way a photograph comes back from the developer slightly darker than the room it depicts. A story about a doll recovered by its manufacturer, and what the workers in the warehouse noticed about the returned dolls when they arrived. Not frightening exactly, but specific enough that the walk home that evening felt different in texture, as though the familiar streets were carrying something they usually put down. A story about a hospital hallway sealed for administrative reasons, and what the woman who had worked nearby said she had noticed in passing it over the years, and how she had eventually rearranged her schedule so as not to pass it at certain hours. And all of them, every single one, began the same way, with Haruto saying clearly and without hurrying, as though this was the most important sentence, and he wanted to be certain everyone had heard it. This is a story I made up. This is not something that actually happened. Kenji remembered the way the phrase landed every time, how it felt almost like a ritual of its own, a small ceremony of permission, after which the classroom seemed to exhale something and then draw in something else in its place. Word moved through the school in the way word always moves among children. Not announced, not explained, simply present one morning where it had not been the morning before. By November, children from other classrooms had begun finding their way to the 5th grade room at the end of the day on the pretext of collecting notebooks or returning borrowed pencil cases or nothing in particular, just happening to be nearby, and they would end up seated on the spare desks near the windows and staying until someone came looking for them from outside. The 6th graders handled their presence more elaborately, arriving with plausible reasons. Homework questions, things to discuss with 5th grade friends, entirely convincing business that fooled no one, and leaving 2 hours later with the inward quality of people who have been somewhere and are not yet ready to say where. Even the very smallest children came sometimes, the 3rd graders with their enormous backpacks, standing in the doorway without committing to anything until someone waved them in, and then sitting completely still throughout in a way that very young children sometimes manage when something has caught their entire attention at once. And then, alongside Haruto's stories, but nourished by them and spreading outward from them, the other things began. The school that autumn had a quality to it that Kenji thought of years later as almost electric, not in any loud or jittery sense, but in the way that the air can change before weather arrives, carrying something charged and expectant that you feel in your hands and the back of your neck before you understand what it is. Kakuri-san arrived first. A spirit invitation passed through Japanese schools for generations, older than any of the children and older than their parents. A piece of paper covered in letters and numbers with a 10-yen coin placed at the center, the understanding being that if you rested the tip of your finger on the coin very lightly, barely touching, and called the spirit's name the right number of times with the right gravity, something might choose to answer. Kenji had participated on the third or fourth occasion, a gray Tuesday in late November, rain beginning outside the classroom windows, the coin on the paper in the center of a ring of children kneeling quietly on the floor, everyone's fingertip only barely present, not pressing anything, only resting there. The first minute produced nothing, and the second, and Kenji's attention had begun to drift into the ordinary middle distance. Something about supper, something about a jacket left near the gymnasium. And then the coin had moved and stopped, and moved again, tracing something slowly across the paper. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had preceded it. Different in a way Kenji found difficult to name, thicker, perhaps, or more inhabited, as though the space had registered something the ordinary afternoon had not. It was not that the movement was necessarily inexplicable. Coins could move for any number of reasons. Fingers had weight. Old school buildings had floors that were never perfectly level. It was that the movement had happened inside a silence the children had assembled together and occupied together, and that kind of shared silence leave a different residue than silence endured alone. He walked home through the rain that evening, past the covered bicycles outside the corner store and the noodle shop with its curtain moving in the wet air, and found himself looking at the ordinary street with the feeling that it had acquired, briefly, a very slight additional layer. Something underneath the visible surface that had not quite fully receded back to where it usually lived. The fortune-telling arrived in Kakuri-san's wake and spread with the generous ease of something that required no special equipment, and that everyone could participate in. Paper charms folded in the ways different children had learned from different sources. Numerology systems based on names and dates that contradicted each other wonderfully and which no one found troubling. Palm reading of an enthusiastic and approximate variety conducted in the stairwells between classes. A group of girls in Kenji's class maintained an elaborate system involving the shadows cast by a ruler at precisely noon, keeping meticulous records for several weeks. The predictions sufficiently open in their wording to accommodate almost any outcome that subsequently arrived. The boys were less systematic, but no less absorbed. And there was a period of perhaps 10 days in which a noticeable portion of the school could be observed walking with unusual deliberateness, counting something quietly under their breath. What the craze gave the children, Kenji thought, was a sense of membership, of being inside something, of having agreed together to take the world seriously in a way they were not often invited to at school, and finding that the world, taken seriously on those terms, was in fact more interesting than it usually appeared. There was a particular pleasure in having a framework, any framework at all, however uncertain, for the territory of what came next. And then the expeditions began, the after-school wanderings that were, looking back, the craze at its fullest expression, the moment at which something classroom contained spilled out into the streets and the cooling autumn air and became something visible to anyone who cared to look. There was an abandoned house not far from school, empty for as long as any of the children could remember, its garden given over entirely to old rain and unattended growth, its wooden gate standing perpetually slightly ajar in the way of a house that had simply decided at some point to stop being fully closed to the world. Someone had said, it was always someone a half-heard thing that arrived already carrying the weight of established fact, that the house had a history, that something had happened there long ago, that if you stood at the gate in the late afternoon and listened carefully, you could sometimes detect from somewhere inside a sound that was not the wind and not the traffic from the main road. Kenji went with 6 others on a Wednesday in late November, the sky already going pale and thin by 4 o'clock, the leaves in the gutters brown and softened by recent rain, and they had stood at the gate in a close row, shoulders almost touching, and looked at the house and listened. What he remembered most from that visit was not anything he had seen or heard, but the quality of attention the group brought to the place, the way that standing somewhere together, really standing there, really attending, made the air around the house feel inhabited by that attention in a way it might not otherwise have been. The smell that came from beyond the gate was the smell of garden left alone for a long time. Damp earth, the slow decay of leaves, something persistently green underneath it, all that the late season had not yet quite extinguished. And Kenji breathed it in and felt the 7 of them settle into something that felt improbably almost like formality, like guests arriving somewhere that expected a certain quality of presence. No one suggested going further than the gate. No one gestured toward the path beyond it. No one said anything about what might or might not be further in. And this felt like a decision that had been made before any of them arrived, as though the threshold had always been understood to be the point, and they had reached it, and that was what the visit required. They walked home together through the early dark, talking about other things. Something that had happened in the gymnasium, an argument about a television program, the ordinary noise of children coming back from somewhere. And Kenji noticed that no one seemed frightened exactly, but that everyone had a certain quietness, a contained inward quality, like people who have been somewhere that asked something of them and are still working out what it asked. The graveyard visits were more organized and more deliberate, and they were, in the end, the ones that attracted the attention of parents, though they were also, Kenji thought, the ones that carried the most genuine feeling, the ones he could still walk through clearly in his memory years afterward. There was a small cemetery 2 streets from school, well-maintained, stone markers in careful rows with a narrow stone-paved path between them. And several children had taken to going there in the early evenings to, as the phrase had come to mean by that point, feel the atmosphere. Feeling the atmosphere meant standing somewhere that seemed to carry some significance and remaining still long enough for something to possibly become noticeable, the precise nature of that something left deliberately open, because closing it down to something specific was felt by general agreement to miss the point entirely. Kenji had gone twice, on late November afternoons when the light was already failing by the time they arrived, and he remembered those visits with a clarity that the more dramatic events of the period somehow had not produced. His footsteps on the stone path, the names and dates carved into the markers, the bare branches of the trees at the cemetery's edge making their patterns against the narrowing sky. In the failing light, the carved characters on the markers became harder to read, and the children would sometimes bend close, one at a time, tracing the strokes with their eyes, and something about that small act of attention, trying to know the name, trying to make the name real, felt to Kenji like the most genuinely serious thing any of them did during that whole period. The other children moved through the space with a care they did not often bring to other things. Voices lowered without anyone's asking, steps placed with consideration among the markers, conversation given more space, more silence between sentences than children usually allow. Kenji thought that this might be one of the stranger effects of the craze. A group of 10-year-olds being, for an hour on certain autumn afternoons, genuinely thoughtful in the presence of those who were no longer present. But the light kept going, and the children kept staying, and the curfew, the understood one, never stated because it had never needed to be stated, kept being quietly revised in the direction that the atmosphere seemed to require. On one occasion, 3 of the children had stayed until the cemetery's stone lanterns, unlit for some time, disappeared entirely into the surrounding dark, and had walked home alone by the light of street lamps, and had not mentioned it to anyone until later. 20 minutes became 30. 30 became an hour, and one evening Kenji arrived home to find his mother in the kitchen with an expression that communicated, without any words at all, that the evening had not proceeded as she had expected. He was not the only one. This became apparent over the following days as parents who crossed paths at the market or the school gate compared accounts and found the accounts matched. A pattern of children expected home at a certain hour who had arrived instead as the street lamps were coming on, in small groups, smelling of cold air and old stone and the particular damp of late autumn grass. A mother had called the school. Kenji's teacher mentioned this with careful understatement, to inquire whether the school was aware that a group of children had been found in the local cemetery at 5:30 on a recent Tuesday evening, sometime after the sun had fully gone down. The school had not been aware, and the conversation that followed was apparently substantial, and the mother called again the following week with additional occasions, and then a second family called, and a third, and the calls became a cluster, and clusters required a response. Kenji's teacher was a patient woman who seemed genuinely to have thought the matter through. The speech she gave the class on a gray Friday morning was careful in the way of something prepared the night before, covering the importance of being home before dark for reasons having nothing to do with anything unusual, the school's concern for the comfort of families, and a diplomatically non-committal discussion of imagination in which the word appeared several times in a tone suggesting it was being offered as a compliment, without ever quite naming what imagination was being distinguished from. The expedition stopped, or at least stopped being organized affairs with multiple participants traveling together in groups, which was close enough for the purposes of those who had called to complain. The Kakuri-san sessions wound down in the quiet way that things wind down when no one will admit to owning them. The coin and the paper ceasing to appear removed by collective unspoken agreement in the way that seasons end, not on a specific day, but accumulated gradually into absence. And the school settled, or seemed to, the corridors returning to their ordinary afternoon brightness, the after-school hours recovering their expected shapes, the adults reassured that the situation had been recognized and addressed. There was a particular quality to that settling, a kind of held breath, the whole building existing in the careful state of something that has been asked to be normal and is doing its best. And beneath it, just perceptibly, the sense that the ground was not quite as even as it appeared. But Kenji, walking home on an ordinary afternoon in the quiet that followed the peak of things, passing the road that led toward the cemetery without turning down it, felt that what had happened over those weeks had not simply gone away, had only withdrawn into something smaller and less visible, the way a tide withdraws but does not cease to be the sea. Haruto was still there, at his desk near the back window, with a book open in front of him, adjusting his glasses with one patient finger as he read, apparently unmoved by the whole episode in the particular way of someone who had understood from the beginning how things would unfold and was now watching them settle, without any particular feeling about the settling. And Kenji, looking across the room at him, had the beginning of something, not yet a thought he could complete, not yet a question he knew how to frame. Only the sense that Haruto had been watching all of it with some private understanding that the rest of them did not share, that there was something he knew about what had happened that had not yet been told, and that whatever it was still being held somewhere behind the quiet steadiness of his face. Outside the classroom windows, the November sky was the even gray of that neighborhood in that season, soft and unhurried above the rooftops, and the last sounds of the school day were dispersing into the corridors, and somewhere a door closed on a teacher's voice, and it was very ordinary, and it was very quiet, and in the quiet there was the patient sense of something that had not yet said everything it had come to say. The craze had subsided, and the school had returned to itself, and the stone markers in the cemetery 2 streets away stood in their rows as they always had, and the gate of the old house at the edge of the district stayed at its customary angle, and everything continued in its familiar shape. And Haruto sat with his book at his desk near the window, turning a page, and waited, and kept whatever it was he was keeping a little while longer, calmly, to himself. Let that moment rest where it settled, soft and still, the way a candle flame holds itself steady after someone has passed quietly through a room. There is no need to move just yet. The night is long, and this story has more left to give. Take a slow breath if you like, and let your shoulders fall a little. Let your hands grow heavy where they lie. The same hours are still unfolding. The same quiet lives continuing just beyond the edge of what we have seen so far, patient as moonlight moving across a floor. When you are ready, and there is truly no rush, we move gently forward, deeper into the same unbroken night. In the back corner of a wooden classroom in a small school on the edge of the city, a bespectacled boy named Haruto had a habit. Before every ghost story he ever told, without a single exception, he began with the same careful opening sentence, the one that said, in a quiet and unhurried way, that this was a story he had made up himself. Kenji had been listening to Haruto's stories for the better part of a year by then, and had come to think of those words as simply part of the ceremony, the way a kettle has to whistle before the tea is ready to pour, unremarkable and expected and somehow comforting. But one afternoon, when the light through the tall classroom windows had gone low and amber, and the distant sound of a broom moved gently somewhere down the corridor, Haruto looked at the small gathering of classmates around him and said, without beginning a story at all, that he wanted to explain something. Not to tell them a story, just to explain. Kenji noticed, in the moment before Haruto spoke, that the room had gone quiet in a particular way. Not the anticipatory quiet of a ghost story about to begin, which had its own distinct flavor, a kind of held-breath readiness, but a different kind, more uncertain, the quiet of people who sense that the usual rules have been set aside for reasons not yet known. Haruto adjusted his glasses with one careful finger, the way he always did when he was about to say something precise, and he mentioned a word, kodadama, and then he paused after saying it, the way you might set down something fragile before you unwrap it, giving the word a moment to simply exist in the room before he went any further. He told them that the word itself was made from two characters, one meaning language or words and one meaning spirit or soul, so that held together, the meaning was something like the living force that resides inside a spoken word, not in the sound of it, but in the intention behind the sound. The idea, as he laid it out slowly and without hurry, was this: that when a person speaks with genuine and deep feeling, with real emotion that carries no irony or lightness wrapped around it, no cushion of humor or habit, the words they speak do not simply carry information from one person to another the way a letter carries news. They carry the feeling itself, sealed inside the words like warmth in a stone, and that feeling arrives wherever the words arrive, attached and real and present. Most of the class was listening with expression somewhere between interest and mild confusion, the look of people learning the rules of a game they have never played, attentive but not yet certain what they were being attentive to. And then Haruto looked very gently and very deliberately at Takashi. Kenji felt rather than saw the attention of the entire room shift in that direction. The way a room full of people will all turn without deciding to toward a window when something moves outside it. Takashi, who was sitting one desk to Kenji's left, and who was widely known among the class as the person most reliably frightened by Haruto's stories, who had on several occasions required a moment to compose himself afterward before he could speak again, looked in that moment both relieved and suspicious at once, which was a combination Kenji had not previously known a single human face could produce. Haruto mentioned that Takashi, as everyone in the room knew, was someone who occasionally said very severe things as jokes. Things spoken lightly, without weight, in the way that friends can say terrible words to each other and have those words land gently, because the friendship itself is the context that makes them safe, that keeps them empty. Takashi, hearing this, nodded slowly and with visible caution, as if uncertain whether he was being offered a compliment or positioned for something. Haruto then began to construct what he described as a hypothetical, careful, almost academic in its structure. in which Takashi did not simply joke, but truly and completely disliked him. Not in the mild way of a long afternoon together, or the irritable way of sitting too close for too many hours, but in a deep and genuine way, a settled and unironic resentment that had no lightness anywhere in it. Suppose Haruto said that Takashi carried this real dislike the way you carry something heavy in both arms, and one day turned toward him and said the same words he had said 100 times before as meaningless jokes, the same sounds in the same order, identical in every way from the outside. This time, though, in the hypothetical, in the carefully imagined world Haruto was building for them in that low amber light, the words would not be empty the way they usually were. They would carry Takashi's genuine feeling wrapped inside them, the way a letter carries the mood of the person who wrote it, sealed in and traveling with the words wherever the words went. And Haruto said, very quietly and entirely without drama, that when those words reached him, they would cause harm. The room was still. Takashi's expression was attempting something skeptical and not quite finding it. Someone near the window said that this could not possibly be correct, because if it were, the world would be a catastrophe. People would be dropping in the streets from the accumulated weight of other people's feelings, and school would be a considerably more dangerous place than it currently appeared. Haruto had been waiting for something like this, and he answered without hurry. The reason ordinary words did not cause that kind of harm was exactly what he had already said. Most people did not truly mean what they said, not with genuine depth, not with that full and unironic weight of real feeling behind the words. The words fell lightly, without anything attached to them, and arrived lightly and dissolved. It was only when the feeling behind a word was entirely sincere, entirely without irony or habit or any layer of lightness, that the words became something other than words. The class absorbed this slowly, and Kenji remembered feeling that he had been given a partial answer that somehow opened a new question. The way answering one door in a corridor reveals another door further along, and the corridor goes on. And then Haruto said something that changed the direction of everything. He asked whether everyone remembered the story about the dolls. The one he had told them some weeks before, in this same room, in this same late afternoon light. The one that had settled into the imagination in that particular way his better stories did, turning up unexpectedly in quiet moments and in the specific darkness that comes just before sleep. Several people nodded, and a few shifted in their seats in a way that was almost unconscious. A small rearrangement that had nothing to do with comfort. The story, as Kenji remembered it, was about a collection of children's dolls that had been recalled by their manufacturer after a terrible accident, and about what had happened to all the feelings that were pressed into those dolls over years of being loved and then taken away from the children who loved them, and about what those gathered feelings had eventually become, and where they had gone, and what they had done when they arrived somewhere. Haruto asked the room, when he had first told that story, what had everyone felt. One or two people admitted to having been frightened, which in this particular room was a significant admission. Being visibly frightened by Haruto's stories was both inevitable and something no one wished to be the first to confess to. Then Haruto asked something that made the room go entirely still. He asked what would have happened if he had not said at the beginning that it was a story he had made up. What if, instead, he had begun by saying that it was something that had actually taken place? The silence that followed had a texture to it, something slightly different from ordinary silence, a small chill at the edges that had not been present before. Kenji found himself, before he could stop the thought, wondering about the small cloth doll that sat on the shelf above his desk at home, who had loved it before it reached him, and whether they had been sad to lose it, and whether they still thought about it. He was quite certain he was not the only one thinking something like this. Haruto observed the quiet around him with the calm of someone who had expected this exactly, and he told them, that feeling, the one moving through the room right now, the small and specific unease about things they owned, things they had discarded, things that might know where they lived, that feeling was precisely what he had been describing. One person holding that feeling, or two, or even a dozen, would not amount to very much. He said, the weight of a single person's private anxiety, or even the combined worry of one small classroom, would not be enough to give a story any real substance. But Haruto had not told the doll story only to this classroom. He had been telling stories long enough that they traveled from one class to the next, from one grade to another, carried home and retold at dinner tables and whispered at sleepovers, passed from one child to the next through the ordinary channels by which things move through a school, so that by the time a story had been traveling for a few weeks, it might have passed through 100 minds, 200 perhaps more. And every mind that held the story, every child who lay in the dark wondering whether it was real, every person who felt that particular cold of genuine unease while thinking about it, each of them was adding something to the story's weight, pressing their feeling into it the way handprints press in a wet clay, leaving something of themselves behind. And if enough of that weight accumulated, if enough genuine fear attached itself to the story of the dolls, not performed fear, not the enjoyable theatrical fear of a ghost story told in good fun, but real fear, the kind that arrives after you turn off the light, then the dolls in the story would stop being something Haruto had invented. They would become real, not real the way furniture or rain are real, not something you could walk over and touch in the ordinary way, but real in the way that Kodadama is real, charged with the sincerity of all those gathered feelings, able to move in the world as things with genuine weight are able to move. Kenji sat very still as this landed, watching Haruto's face and trying to determine, in the way that you try to read something written in a language you almost but do not quite know, whether Haruto believed this himself. He found a question did not resolve easily, because Haruto did not speak the way someone speaks when performing a belief for an audience. He spoke the way someone speaks when reporting an observation they have made carefully and tested over time, the way you speak about the behavior of water or the particular properties of old wood. Matter of fact, without insistence, without the slight edge of someone who needs you to agree, simply stating what seemed to be the case. It was Takashi, who had been very quiet since his name was used in the hypothetical, who asked the question that had been sitting somewhere in the back of everyone's mind without quite forming into words. In a voice that was trying to sound like idle curiosity, he wondered aloud whether the disclaimer at the beginning was the important part, whether saying it was made up was what kept the weight from accumulating. Haruto said that yes, that was exactly right, that when he said this is a story I made up, the minds of the people listening would settle into a posture of pleasant imagination rather than genuine belief, and feelings that come from imagination are lighter than feelings that come from genuine belief, less loaded with the sincerity that gives Kodadama its weight. So those words at the beginning of every story, the words they had all heard so many times they had come to feel like furniture, like part of the room itself, were not a disclaimer at all. They were a kind of protection, a small, careful gesture made at the very beginning of every story, a way of signaling to the fear that might gather. You are welcome here, but you must remain light. You must not press yourself into this too deeply. He said it the way you might describe leaving a window open so that the air can move freely through a room, rather than sealing everything shut and letting the heat build and build with nowhere to go. Without those words, without that small permission for the listeners to hold the story at a slight remove, the feelings that gathered around a story would grow heavier, more capable of pressing themselves into the story's fabric and giving it a kind of life it was never meant to have. He said all of this the way he always said things, quietly, without drama, as if he were describing something perfectly ordinary. And then he simply stopped speaking, and the room sat with it in the fading light. The classroom around them was the same as it had always been. The same chalk smell, the same thin boards underfoot that creaked in one particular spot near the window, the same quality of late light going thin and gold against the far wall. But Kenji had the distinct sense that the room had become larger while Haruto was talking, or perhaps more accurately that its walls had become less certain than they had been an hour before. Takashi, after a moment, observed that this explained why he had never truly been frightened by the doll story, which was almost certainly not accurate, and which no one in the room chose to address. Someone asked whether the protection might work in both directions, whether a story that was genuinely true could still be held at a distance simply by labeling it as something made up. Haruto considered this with his glasses catching the last of the afternoon light, his expression going inward for a moment before he answered. He thought it probably would. He said, the listener's belief, or the absence of belief, was the mechanism, and the label of fiction would tend to prevent genuine fear from taking root, even in a story that had truly happened. He said this thoughtfully, though, with a small hesitation at the end, as if he were turning over some case he had not yet worked all the way through. Some story told with such precise and convincing detail that the fiction label could not quite hold it in place against the listener's own instinct that something about it was real. No one followed up on this. The afternoon had grown quieter, and there was something about sitting in that room at that particular hour that made extended questions feel slightly harder to form than usual, as if the room itself preferred the silence to settle. Kenji walked home that evening the way he always did, past the same small shops and the same stretch of fence with a broken board that rattled when the wind moved through it, past the elderly woman who swept her step at this hour every day without ever looking up. He noticed somewhere between the school gate and his own front door that he was paying attention to things he did not ordinarily pay attention to the quality of the words people said around him as he passed, the way the shopkeeper's greeting traveled across the street to a customer, the brief argument at the crosswalk that ended quietly and without conclusion. He was listening. He realized for some quality in the words moving around him that would tell him whether they were light or carrying something. He could not have said precisely what he expected to find, only that Haruto had described something that now seemed present all around him, in an ordinary exchange of language between ordinary people going about ordinary evenings, and he was newly aware of it the way you become newly aware of the sound of your own breathing once someone has pointed it out. He found himself walking more slowly than usual, attending to the small sounds of the early evening with a kind of careful attention he had not known to bring to them before. At home, he passed the shelf above his desk without stopping. He did not look at the small cloth doll that sat there in its usual place, and he did not think about whether it had been loved before it reached him, or by whom. He simply continued to the kitchen, where his mother was cooking, and the smell of rice and warming broth filled the small apartment in that particular way it did on cool evenings. And he said he was home, and meant it fully, and sat down in the ordinary warmth of it and let the evening be what it was. That, as Kenji would remember it years later, was how the afternoon of Haruto's explanation came to rest. Not with a conclusion exactly, not with the satisfying click of something solved and set aside, but with a stillness that settled over the class in the days that followed, a slight and almost imperceptible change in the way they held the stories they heard. The way you hold something differently once you know it has more weight than it appeared. Because what Haruto had given them that afternoon was not another ghost story. Not really. It was something quieter and in some ways stranger, the suggestion that stories themselves were living things, that fear was a kind of nourishment they could absorb, and that language spoken with enough sincerity could reach across the space between one person and another and do something genuine in the world. And for a long while after, whenever someone would ask Kenji what had made Haruto different from anyone else they had known at that age, what set him apart from the ordinary world of school desks and chalk dust and the small familiar disagreements of childhood, Kenji would find himself thinking not of any particular ghost story, not of the dolls or the dark houses or the figures glimpsed at the edge of someone's telling. He would think of a particular afternoon, and the amber light through tall windows, and a careful, unhurried explanation, and the way Haruto had looked entirely calm while saying things that ought, by any reasonable measure, to have been unsettling. And he would think most of all of those small words at the beginning. This is a story I made up, and how they had always sounded so simple, so unremarkable, and how it turned out they had been, the entire time, the most important thing Haruto ever said. A small spell quietly cast at the start of everything. Let that moment rest where it landed, soft and still, like the last note of a melody that lingers in the air long after the sound has faded. There is no hurry here. The same night holds everything. The same slow hours moving gently forward, patient and unhurried. Take a breath, if you like, slow and easy, and let your body settle a little deeper into wherever you have found your rest. This story is not finished. It continues quiet and steady into the next passage of that long, tender evening, where the people we've come to know are still there, still breathing, still finding their way forward, one soft step at a time. In the old classroom on the second floor of Kenji's elementary school, the morning after Haruto's quiet explanation about Kodadama, the spirit that lives inside spoken words, something had shifted completely and without announcement. It was not a dramatic change, not the kind that announces itself with noise or ceremony. It was more the way a room feels different after a window has been closed, calmer somehow, more contained, the air itself a little stiller than it had been the day before. The children arrived that Tuesday morning, and without anyone having organized it or agreed to it, the ghost story competitions that had been filling every recess simply did not resume. There was no teacher standing at the front to declare that the fun was over, no announcement over the school intercom. There was only a collective and almost wordless understanding that the rules had changed, that something about the game made it feel different to play now. Haruto had explained it. You see, gently, carefully, in that particular way he had of laying a thought out like a cloth on a table, so you could see all its edges. And once he had explained it, the fever broke. Kenji remembered walking into school that morning and noticing that the usual clusters of children around the shoe lockers, the ones who had been swapping ghost stories like trading cards all through the autumn, were talking about other things entirely, baseball scores and television programs, and whose mother had packed the best lunch. He remembered thinking that it was strange how fast it had happened, how one conversation with a boy in round glasses could unwind weeks of mounting excitement the way pulling a single thread can unravel a whole seam. The craze for haunted house visits after school evaporated. The Ouija board sessions, the fortune-telling circles, the dares that had kept children wandering near the old cemetery until their parents telephoned the school in a state of considerable alarm. All of it dissolved, like frost on a morning that turns warm, quietly, and without a fuss. But Haruto's storytelling did not stop. That was the particular and rather lovely thing about what happened next. The thing Kenji would find himself returning to many times over the years that followed. The boom ended, but the sessions continued, small and quiet, and belonging now only to their classroom, tucked away in the long golden hours after school. Word had spread through the school, as word does among children, that Haruto had explained why he always began his stories with the same opening phrase, why he always said that this was a story he had made up. The reason being, as near as anyone could summarize it, that a story told as fiction stayed safely in the world of fiction, and one believed too fervently by too many people might acquire a weight of its own. Most of the older children in the school had nodded thoughtfully at this, and then wandered off to find less philosophically complicated ways to spend their recesses, and the school settled back into something resembling ordinary calm. But in Kenji's class, among Haruto's actual classmates, what remained was not fear, and not quite relief either. It was something more like appreciation, a quiet particular fondness for something they had come to understand a little better. They felt, or believed they felt, that they understood now what Haruto was doing when he told his stories, and that understanding made listening to him feel like being let in on something, like being handed a small secret and trusted to carry it carefully. And so, when the weather turned cold and the ginkgo trees along the school path went yellow and then shed their leaves to be swept away by the groundskeeper's broom, Kenji's class developed a quiet habit. On certain afternoons, not every day, not on any fixed schedule, but when the moment felt right, when the week had been ordinary enough and the autumn light was coming in low through the tall classroom windows, some of them would stay behind after the last bell. They would shift the small wooden desks aside, or simply pull their chairs into a loose arrangement near the back of the room. And someone would look at Haruto, and Haruto would look back at them through his round glasses with an expression that said he had been expecting this, that he had something ready. The sessions were smaller now, more intimate, perhaps 8 or 10 children at most, the ones who had been there from the beginning and a few others who had heard enough to want to be included. Occasionally a child from another class would appear in the doorway, someone who had been told about Haruto by an older sibling or a neighbor in a different grade, and they would hover there looking tentatively hopeful, and someone would wave them in, and they would find a place on the floor or perch on the edge of a desk and listen without speaking. The teachers, to their considerable credit, mostly looked the other way. Kenji would think about this later, more than once, and decide it was one of the more gracious things the adults in his life had ever done without making a production of it. This quiet permission, this deliberate and generous not quite noticing. One teacher in particular, a woman named Tanaka Sensei, who ran their homeroom that 5th grade autumn, had a habit of walking past the classroom window after school and pausing for just a moment, long enough to register that the children were seated and calm and not running anywhere dangerous, before continuing on down the corridor. That was the full extent of her intervention, and it felt, in its way, like a small gift. Haruto would not begin immediately when everyone was settled. That was one of the things Kenji noticed and came to understand as deliberate. He would sit at a desk near the window with his school bag in his lap, his glasses catching the light in that particular fingerprinted way they always did, and he would wait a little, letting the sounds of the school outside, footsteps in the corridor, a door closing somewhere distant, the athletics club calling to one another on the far field, settle and thin out and become something quieter. Then he would say it, that familiar phrase that had become almost ceremonial over the months, that this was a story he had made up, and the room would shift just slightly, the way a room shifts when someone turns off an overhead light and the lamp in the corner becomes the only source of warmth. Kenji always sat near the back when they gathered like this, and he would watch the faces of the listening children as much as he would follow the story itself. There was something about the quality of attention in a room full of people who are truly, completely absorbed in something, a stillness that is different from ordinary stillness, a particular texture to the quiet, as though the air itself has agreed to behave. Haruto's stories were careful, unhurried things built from small and specific details the way a house is built from individual bricks, and listening to them required a willingness to slow down, to follow at Haruto's pace rather than getting ahead of him. He had a way with endings that Kenji always found satisfying and slightly disquieting in equal measure. His stories did not resolve cleanly, did not tie themselves up with an explanation that made everything sensible, but arrived instead at a place that felt correct, the way a piece of music can end on an unexpected note, and yet somehow seem more right than the obvious choice would have been. There were children who found this frustrating, who wanted the answer, who needed to be told what the strange figure in the corridor actually was, whether the locked room held something or nothing, whether the woman at the well had ever been real. Haruto would smile a little at those questions and say, carefully, that the most interesting part of any strange story was the part that remained unconfirmed, because the moment you could confirm it, you stopped imagining, and the imagination was where all the real work happened anyway. The children who understood this nodded, and the ones who didn't understood a little better by the end of the school year. The year turned, and the children who had been fifth graders became sixth graders, which in a Japanese elementary school means the oldest children in the building, the ones the smaller children watch with something between awe and mild anxiety as they move through the corridors. The classroom changed rooms, and Tanaka-sensei was replaced by a new homeroom teacher, a woman named Fujiwara-sensei, who was younger and wore her hair a little long for a teacher, and who had, it became clear within the first week, an extremely tolerant attitude toward whatever the students chose to do with their after-school hours. She had perhaps been warned about them, or had simply assessed the situation and decided that a room of 12-year-olds gathered voluntarily to listen to a classmate tell stories was not the kind of problem that required her intervention. Either way, the sessions continued, settling into the rhythms of sixth grade, the way familiar things settle, becoming simply part of the texture of the year. Kenji had stopped thinking of them as unusual by this point. They were simply something his class did, one of those particular features of a particular group of children at a particular moment that you only recognize as unusual once you have left it behind and had years to look back. What he remembered most when he thought about those afternoons much later was less the content of any individual story than the feeling of the room. The slant of the light through the windows changing with each season, the smell of chalk and the wooden floor, the particular quality of Haruto's voice as it moved through a story, steady and unhurried, like water finding its way down a hillside without needing to be directed. He remembered the way Haruto would pause sometimes in the middle of a sentence, not from uncertainty, but from the opposite of it, from a deliberate and considered choice to let something land before moving on. He remembered the way the listening faces tilted slightly forward in those pauses, the way the room seemed to hold itself very still. Haruto in sixth grade was much the same as Haruto in fifth grade, only more so, if that makes sense. The glasses were the same round frames, lightly smudged at the edges as always, and the school bag was heavier than ever with library books, and the careful, considered quality of his thinking had deepened over the 2 years of those informal gatherings into something more assured. He had developed, Kenji noticed, an ability to read a room that felt remarkable for someone his age. He knew when to slow down and when to move the story forward, when the children were with him completely and when they needed something more concrete to hold on to, when to add a detail, and when to let the silence do the work. It was the kind of knowing you don't find in books, or at least not directly. And watching Haruto deploy it so naturally, in a borrowed classroom after school with his lunchbox still under his desk, felt like watching something quietly rare. The other children had given him a name somewhere in that first autumn. Great Sensei, or just great. A name that was both a joke and entirely sincere in the way children's names for one another often manage to be both at once. More accurate than the person who coined it knew. Kenji thought about that name sometimes and decided it was right in ways no one had fully intended. There was something genuinely great about what Haruto did, something that deserved a word larger than being talented at frightening people. He built things inside the minds of the people listening. Kenji thought, careful, specific, particular things, rooms you could almost remember being inside, people you could almost recall meeting, and then he left them there, these imagined rooms and imagined presences, to settle quietly into memory like objects placed on a shelf. Summer came, as it does, with its particular heat and its cicadas and the exhausted, relieved feeling of the last school day before vacation, and the children scattered to their families and their summer plans and their homework packets that would remain mostly untouched until the final weekend of August. Haruto mentioned, quietly, near the end of July, that he was planning to spend the break doing some reading, which surprised no one, and also that he was going to visit some relatives out in the countryside, which surprised no one either. The class said their goodbyes in the easy, casual way that people say goodbye when they fully expect to see each other again in a few weeks, without ceremony, without much lingering, and headed out into the bright August afternoon. The summer passed in the way summers pass when you are 12, and the world is still mostly uncomplicated, slowly at first. Then all at once, as though time had been saving up. When the new school term began in September, the children arrived in their autumn clothes to find most of their classmates already at their desks, and they counted heads in that unconscious way you do, and gradually noticed that Haruto was not there. This was unusual enough to mention. In 2 years of shared classrooms, Haruto had never once been absent for anything that registered as significant, and a few people asked around, and eventually someone reported that he had come down with something near the end of the summer, that he had been under the weather since before the term started. Fujiwara-sensei confirmed it with her customary brevity, that Haruto had been unwell and would need a few more days, and that was the extent of the information available. The class settled back into the first week's routines, the new assignments, the new seating chart, the particular low-level strangeness of classroom that is almost but not quite the same as it was before the break, and Haruto's absence sat quietly at the edge of everything, taking up a particular quality of space. Someone said at some point during that first week that the sessions would simply have to wait, that they couldn't very well start without Haruto, and everyone had agreed without needing to discuss it further. The afternoons felt a little longer without that gathering to look forward to, the classroom a little more ordinary in the after-school hour. The light coming through the windows at the same low September angle, but falling on pushed-together desks rather than a loose circle of attentive faces. Kenji found himself thinking about the sessions more than he had when they were actually happening. The particular quality of anticipation, he supposed, which is always a little keener than the experience itself. He wondered what story Haruto might have prepared for the new year, what corner of the imagination he had visited over the summer and come back from with something worth sharing, what strange and careful world he had been quietly assembling in his mind through those long August weeks. He thought about the way Haruto always began, That small, careful sentence that had become, over 2 years, almost a kind of invocation. That this was a story he had made up, meaning you were safe, meaning we were here together in this borrowed room with the light coming in at this particular angle, and I have something to show you. About a week into the new term, Haruto came back. He arrived looking a little thin and a little quieter than usual, with the particular quality of someone who has spent time in bed while the world went on without him. And someone said lightly that he had been living the dream, one long summer vacation, while the rest of them had been conjugating verbs and copying out the periodic table. And Haruto had laughed the soft, still recovering sort of laugh of someone who is almost well, but not quite. By the afternoon, word had moved through the classroom with the speed that word moves among children who have been waiting for something, that Haruto was back and the afternoon session might resume. And by the time the last bell rang, there was already a quiet gathering at the classroom door. Kenji arrived to find a familiar arrangement taking shape. Desks shifted, chairs moved into the loose circle they had settled on over 2 years of these sessions. The light coming through the windows in that particular early September way, warm and slanted, the kind of light that makes ordinary rooms feel briefly significant. Haruto was already at the window desk, his school bag in his lap, his glasses catching the afternoon sun the way they always had, and he looked at the children arranging themselves, and he smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had been looking forward to this. They waited in the comfortable way they had learned to wait over 2 years of these sessions, while the sounds of the school day outside thinned, and the room found its particular quality of stillness. And then Haruto said what he always said at the beginning, quietly, the way you might say something that has become so familiar it needs no emphasis. That this was a story he had made up, and the room shifted in that small, reliable way it always did, and the afternoon held its breath, and the September light lay across the desks and the floor and the faces of the gathered children, and everything was for that one careful moment, exactly as it had always been. And Kenji leaned back in his chair and listened, and the story began. Let that moment rest where it fell, quiet and unhurried, the way a lantern dims slowly rather than going out all at once. We stay with them a little longer in the same night, the same stillness that has been gathering all this time around the edges of the story. There is no need to move quickly. You can take a slow breath here, let your shoulders settle, let the weight of the day drift a little further away. The night continues, and so does this telling. The same thread, the same lives, simply turning now toward what comes next, gently, as 1 hour eases into another without any sound at all. When Haruto came back to school that September, thinner than anyone remembered, and still pale from the fever that had kept him home for the entire first week of 6th grade, Kenji noticed the particular way he settled into his chair. Carefully, like someone testing familiar ground after a long absence, and knew from the look on his face that there would be a story. There was one, as it turned out, a story about a boy who had gone to visit his grandparents in the countryside during summer vacation and had found something at a shrine on a hillside that he had not been able to stop thinking about since. Haruto had lost weight. His glasses looked slightly larger than they used to, or perhaps the same size and just more visible on his face now. and he pushed them up with one finger in that familiar way, as perhaps 12 of them settled into the usual loose half circle of a Wednesday afternoon. Rice crackers from the school store, the sound of late summer light through the western windows, and the particular quality of attention that these sessions always carried, the readiness for something to happen. He said the story had come to him while he was lying still during the long, slow days of the fever, and that it had stayed with him. What Kenji would only notice later, on a different afternoon in a different month, was that Haruto had not said it, had not offered the phrase that had opened every single one of his stories since 5th grade, the quiet ritual. This is a story I made up. It was simply missing the way a step might be missing in a dark staircase. In the moment, there was only the light and the crackers and the small forward lean of a room paying attention. Haruto told them about a boy of about 10 on summer vacation, taking the train alone for the first time to stay with his grandparents in the countryside for 2 weeks. Not remote countryside, Haruto mentioned. Not the kind of place in old photographs where the roads are still mud, but a modest, functional sort of town where the convenience store was a 10-minute walk and the station platform had a vending machine and the air smelled of something green and patient and slow. The grandparents' house was at the edge of town, in the part where the streets narrowed and the houses were older, and behind the house was a low hillside with a path of worn stone steps going up through the cedar trees. The boy had a school assignment to complete. Haruto explained a summer free research project, and he had chosen to document the local shrines and temples, which seemed like a sensible task for a town that had accumulated a number of each over many years, and which gave him a good excuse to wander on his own. So on the 3rd morning, he borrowed a notebook and a camera and walked up the stone path, each step cupped slightly at the center from the passage of many years of feet, the cedar resin warm in the August heat, the trees close on either side. The shrine at the top of the hill was small, Haruto said, the kind of local shrine that belongs to no particular institution, but simply exists because it has always been there, tended by whoever lives nearby out of a habit that has long outlasted its original reason. There was a stone basin for water, dry now, with cedar dust settled in the bottom, and 2 stone lanterns with small webs grown between their feet and the ground, and a low wooden fence in gentle disrepair, and the shrine building itself, about the size of a large garden shed, its door standing just slightly ajar to let the summer air move through. He walked around the outside first, making his careful notes in the slightly formal handwriting of a child given a task, sketching the outline of the roof, copying what he could of the characters above the entrance. It was at the back of the shrine, Haruto said, in a narrow strip of ground between the wooden wall and where the cedars began in earnest, where the light became something filtered and still and very green, that the boy found the first thing. A lid, circular and large, 1.5 meters across, perhaps, made of thick wood, lying flat against the earth among fallen cedar needles and the small, settled evidence of seasons passing over it undisturbed. The boy crouched beside it, and what struck him first, Haruto said, was how genuinely old it was. Not decoratively old, not the kind of old thing that has been cleaned and put on display, but simply completely matter-of-factly old, the way a stone is old, the way the hillside itself is old. He tried to lift one edge and was surprised by the weight. The wood was dense and heavy in a way that seemed out of proportion to its size, layer upon layer of planks joined together until the whole thing was nearly 10 centimeters thick, built in the manner of things built when there was no expectation they would ever need to be replaced. The top surface showed the grain of the wood still, readable as a material once living. But when he managed to tilt the edge and see the underside was different. The underside was scorched, not burned through, not charred in the way fire chars things, but darkened evenly across the entire surface, as if it had been held for a very long time near great heat, or as if something on the other side had been, very slowly, very patiently, pressing against it from beneath. He pressed his thumb against the darkened wood and found it smooth and sealed, without residue, without any smell he could name. And then he looked around for what a lid of that size might be meant to cover. There was no well, no pit, no depression in the ground, nothing that could explain what had needed to be closed. Only the cedar roots and the filtered light, and a quiet he could not quite account for. And so, as curious children will, he thought to look inside the shrine itself. The interior was dim after the brightness outside, and it took a moment for his eyes to settle. And when they did, he saw the altar. On a low wooden altar at the center of the room, propped upright and facing the entrance, was another lid, the same circular shape, the same approximate diameter, standing with the clear deliberateness of something placed there by someone who had reasons that were not available to a visiting child with a notebook. White paper offerings hung around it in their zigzag rows, and before the lid a rope of braided straw had been strung, the kind that marks something as set apart, as requiring a particular quality of attention from anyone who came near. Haruto's voice was even and unhurried as he described this, Kenji recalled, and his eyes were fixed at a point just above the group's heads, the way they went when a story was very clear to him, as if he were reading it from the air rather than retrieving it from memory. He stepped over the threshold and moved toward the altar, and as he came close he saw that the lid was simply leaning against the altar's face, not covering anything, not fastened to anything, merely standing there in that tended, deliberate way. Curious now in the genuine way, his notebook forgotten at his side, the boy ducked beneath the braided rope and moved around to the back of the upright lid. And there, pressed flat against the back surface of the wooden lid, was a metal plate, circular, nearly the same size and black, not darkened by time or weather in the ordinary way metals become dull, but black in a way that seemed intentional, final, as if the blackness were the thing itself and not a quality it had accumulated over years. He leaned close, Haruto said, and the metal was certainly old. He could see the faint unevenness of its surface, the way ancient things hold the memory of the hands that shaped them, but it did not catch the light the way metal usually does. It seemed, instead, to take the light in and not return it. He tried to separate the two objects, the wooden lid and the metal plate, worked his fingers along the margin between them, pressing and pulling, looking for any give or seam, but the wood and metal were joined so completely that they might as well have grown together. He pressed and pulled for a while longer, found nothing, and eventually gave up and took his photographs, 3 careful frames, leaning close to the surface, and then sat on the floor of the dim shrine and drew the plate in his notebook, pressing the pen firmly, trying to capture a blackness that was not quite like other blacks. Then he went home, ate his grandmother's dinner, and said nothing about the lid or the plate because there was nothing to report, only things that had been seen. When the photographs came back from the developer, Haruto continued very quietly. Every other frame on a roll had come out clearly. The stone basins, the lanterns, the other shrines, the exterior of the building on the hill. The 3 frames he had taken of the metal plate were simply black. Not overexposed, not fogged, not poorly lit, but black. A complete and textureless black, as if the film in those particular frames had registered nothing at all, or had registered something so total that it left no room for anything else. The developer brought them along anyway when the boy pressed, and he held them up to the kitchen window at his grandparents' house, and there was nothing to see, only the black and the ordinary afternoon light around the edges of it. The dreams began that same week. They were not frightening dreams, Haruto said gently. Or not exactly. Not in the way the word usually means. They were persistent and specific, and they returned each night with a patient regularity, the way certain weather returns, the way certain quiet thoughts find you whenever the house goes still. In the dream, the boy was in the shrine again, and the lid was before him as before, and he was trying to separate the lid from the metal plate, calmly, methodically, without urgency, the way one works at something merely stuck. And in the dream, as in the shrine, nothing moved. He would press and pull and work at the edges, and the wood and metal would hold their perfect union. And then he would wake, and it would be morning, and the feeling he carried out of the dream was not fear, but something more like mild, persistent frustration, the sensation of a task left not quite done. The preoccupation did not lift during the days. Haruto said, did not scatter in the presence of ordinary morning things the way dream feelings usually do. The boy would be eating breakfast and find himself thinking about the exact quality of the metal surface, the weight of the blackness toward the center versus the edge, the angle at which the plate had pressed against the wood. His free research project went untouched, and the notebooks that had begun so neatly with measurements and careful observations gradually gave way, page by page, to sketches of a circle, the same outline over and over, filled each time with dense, careful hatching. The boy trying and not quite managing to capture a black that was not quite like other blacks. He kept the blank photographs on the corner of his desk and sometimes just looked at them, held them at different angles in the window light, as if patience might eventually reveal what the camera had been unable to take. And then the dreams changed. Perhaps 10 nights before the end of summer vacation, the boy was in the shrine again, his hands at the edge of the lid as always, and the lid moved. Only slightly less than a centimeter, a small and definite give, the sensation of something that has been completely fixed for a long time beginning, very quietly, to reconsider. He pressed a little harder, and the lid held at that new position, and then he woke. And from that night on, Haruto told them, his voice very quiet, and even in the September classroom, The lid shifted a little more with each passing night, each dream leaving the gap between the wood and the metal fractionally wider. A slightly thicker line of absolute darkness revealed between the two surfaces with each visit. The feeling this gave him, Haruto said, speaking slowly now, as if choosing each word with particular care, was something he had tried to name and found he could not quite, something near anticipation, but not exactly that word, closer to the particular feeling of being very nearly on the edge of understanding something you have wondered about for a long time, when the answer seems almost close enough to sense its shape. He had stopped reading. Haruto continued, stopped joining his grandparents for their evening walks with any real attention, stopped doing almost anything except the sketching and the sitting with the photographs and the waiting for the nights to arrive. The summer was ending, and the lid in his dreams was coming slowly open. Haruto let a small silence rest over the room after that. In the classroom, the September evening had arrived while no one was watching. The sky through the windows gone from afternoon blue to something softer and less certain, and no one spoke for a moment. Kenji sat with the story settling around them, feeling the particular held quality that Haruto's stories always produced. Not quite fear in the moment, but a closeness, a sense of the room having grown smaller and more still. And the story rested there, in the warm September air and the fading light, with the boy in his circle of black and his patient nights, and the lid in the dream coming open by degrees, and the darkness on the other side of it widening, slowly and without hurry. And that, perhaps, is the right place to let it rest for tonight. Let that moment rest a little longer, quiet and unhurried, the way still water holds the shape of something that has just passed through it. We stay with them a while, in the silence that settles after words have been spoken and heard and received. There is no need to move quickly. If you would like, take a slow breath now and let your shoulders soften just a little. The same night continues around them. The same stillness, the same darkness held gently in place. And without any rush at all, the story draws us a little further in, deeper into that long, quiet evening, into what comes next. Somewhere in the late summer classroom, the light was going long and amber through the windows, and Haruto was speaking very quietly now, the way he always spoke when a story had arrived at the part that could not be hurried. He said that the boy in the story, a boy who had spent the middle weeks of August at his grandparents' house in the countryside, had come home carrying photographs that would not develop and a notebook full of careful sketches, and one other thing he had not quite chosen to bring. He had brought the dreams, or perhaps the dreams had followed him home, the way certain kinds of weather follow a person from a place they have visited and do not quite leave when the train departs and the distance grows. The first dream came on the third night after the boys returned to the city, and it was not frightening, not exactly. It was simply the shrine again, the small cedar-paneled room in an afternoon light that felt like memory, the boy standing before the altar where the wooden lid rested on its circle of Shimenawa rope, the rope looped and tied in the way such ropes are tied when the thing beneath them matters. The room smelled of incense that had been burning and not burning for so long, it had become simply the smell of the room itself. The way old places absorb the things done in them over enough years, and the light came in at the same angle it had come in on the afternoon he had visited, and everything was very still. In the dream, he did what he had tried and failed to do in the real shrine. He reached for the lid and worked his fingers beneath the edge where old wood met old wood and began, with all the patience of a dreaming person, to lift. And the lid did not move, Haruto told them. It held absolutely still against his fingertips, the grain pressing back, his nails bending slightly against the old wood, and no matter how he adjusted his grip or shifted his weight, nothing gave, and after a time he simply stood there with his hands still pressed against the wood and the room very quiet around him. Then he woke, empty-handed, in a darkened room, the summer ceiling above him, a pale stripe of moonlight through the window, and he lay still for a moment, trying to remember what it was he had been reaching for. And then the memory settled, and it carried no alarm with it, just a quiet noticing the particular feeling of having been interrupted in the middle of something. The second night, the dream returned unchanged, and the third, and after the fourth, the boys stopped marking their return in any particular way. They had become less like recurring events and more like rooms he went back to, the way you return each morning to a desk where something waits, because that is simply where the work is. During the days, his summer reading sat on the desk beside the unfinished project on local shrines, and his grandmother asked whether he was getting enough sleep, and the boy said yes and meant it. His sleep was deep and easy. It was simply that his sleep had somewhere to be now, and that somewhere was the shrine and the lid. He took out the photographs instead and held them in the afternoon light, the black ones, the ones that had come back from the developer as smooth, dark rectangles with no image, and turned them in his hands, and the light made no difference at all. They were dark all the way through, the way certain depths are dark not because no light has found them, but because they have never been the kind of place light stays. And he sketched the metal plate, drawing it from memory in his notebook over and over, the slight irregularity of the rim, the texture of old oxidation, the way the center seemed to pull the dark inward, as though the darkness there had its own gravity, deepening the closer you came to the middle. He also found himself lying down earlier each evening than he normally would, closing his eyes while the summer light was still fading outside the window, not from tiredness, but from something closer to intent, the way a person arrives early to something they have been thinking about all day. His grandmother would sometimes find him in the evening with the notebook open and the pencil still moving, the room having gone dark around him without his noticing, and she would turn on the lamp gently and set a cup of tea at his elbow, and the boy would thank her and look up and be mildly surprised to find that evening had arrived while he was somewhere else. Haruto's voice in the classroom was very even as he described all of this. Kenji would remember the same unhurried evenness he maintained whenever a story was building towards something, as though the patience of the telling and the patience of the thing being described had come to match each other. The fifth night, Haruto recalled, was when the dream shifted. The boy stood before the lid and reached for it and pressed his fingers in and began to lift, and the lid moved. Not very much, a fraction of something, barely enough to see, barely enough to feel except as a tremor traveling up through the fingertips. But it moved, and in the particular logic of dreams, the boy understood at once that this was what he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting a movement so small that it might easily have been missed, and yet there it was unmistakably real. The lid settled back when he released the pressure, but it had moved, and when he woke, the feeling of that movement was still in his hands, a warmth in the palms, a memory of resistance giving way, as faint as a sound heard through a wall in another room. From the sixth night onward, Haruto told them the dreams were less like returning and more like continuing. Each night the boy arrived in the shrine room and found the lid already at the position the previous dream had left it, the gap a little wider, his work partially done, as though the nights were a single long effort, and the waking hours between them simply intervals for patience. There was something in it, Haruto mentioned, that was not glad exactly, but was something adjacent to glad. The quiet satisfaction of returning to work in progress and finding it exactly where you left it, and perhaps just slightly further along than you remembered. A centimeter, the first night after the shift, a thin shadow visible between the lid and the plate beneath, the Shimenawa swaying once in a draft that had no particular source, and then going still. 2 centimeters the next, and the darkness in the gap had acquired a quality that the boy, in the dreaming, found himself trying to name and failing. It was not the ordinary dark of a closed space. It was somehow more directional than that, the kind of dark that suggests it continues far beyond what the eye can reach, the way a hallway goes around a corner and you cannot say with certainty where it ends. 3 centimeters, Haruto said softly. 4, and here he paused, the real Haruto in the classroom, glancing around at the faces watching him, making sure the room was still with him, and then went on. During the waking hours of those final summer days, he occupied a state that was difficult to name. Not fear, not agitation, nothing as turbulent as either of those things. Just a sustained and quiet attention, the way a person waits in readiness when they have been expecting something for a long time and can sense, without being able to say exactly why, that the waiting is nearly over. He sketched the plate so many times the notebook pages softened under his pencil, each drawing a little more precise than the last, a little more exact about the quality of the black of the center, as though through the repetition, he was learning the plate's face the way you learn a face, by seeing it again and again in different lights until you know it even without seeing. His grandparents had stopped asking about the project or the reading list. Not because they had stopped wondering, but because his manner carried the settled quality that makes adults feel, unreasonably but persistently, that everything is probably going to be fine. Then Haruto said, and the classroom had been very still for some time now. There came a night when the lid was tilted so far from the plate that it rested nearly upright against the altar wall, as though it had at last released the position it had been holding for a very long time, and found in that releasing something like rest. And the full surface of the metal plate was visible in the dream for the first time. Every part of it, unobstructed, the complete circle of dark and oxidized metal. And it was exactly as he had seen it in the shrine on that August afternoon, and exactly as he had drawn it in his notebook. But in the dream, the blackness was different, changed in some way he could not quite fix in words, even in the privacy of his own dreaming. It moved, Haruto told them, his voice barely above a murmur. Not the plate itself, but the darkness in it, the surface of the darkness, It moved the way very still water moves at depth, a slow pressure from below that was not quite visible, but was unmistakably present, something that had been waiting a long time and had not grown impatient. The shrine room in this dream was very dark except for the plate, which seemed to carry its own variety of darkness. The way certain things are visible at night precisely because they're darker than the dark around them. A more particular dark, a more intentional one. He stood very close, and the air near the plate had a quality of absence. Not cold, not warm, neither welcoming nor refusing, simply without the ordinary properties of air, as though the air nearest the surface had been somewhere else for a very long time and still carried the stillness of that other place. He reached toward the plate, and his palm was nearly at the surface, and that was when the voice arrived. It was very quiet and very patient, the kind of voice that suggests it has been speaking for longer than you have been present to hear it. And what it was asking was simple. Haruto told them, a command to open, the same two words repeated in the same calm and unchanged rhythm, over and over, as though the asking had been going on for a very long time, and there was no reason to alter the tempo now. He leaned closer, because the words were clearer at closer range, and then leaned still closer, until his ear was nearly at the surface of the plate, and the cold he had expected from old metal was simply absent. The plate, at that proximity, had no temperature at all, neither the chill of iron nor the warmth of a living thing. Just a neutral nothing, like reaching into a place where temperature itself had not yet arrived. And his ear touched the surface. And in that same moment, Haruto said, in a voice so level that the classroom had to lean slightly toward him to catch it, something came out of the plate. An arm, dark and slow. Not fast, not sudden, nothing that would break the stillness of the room. Just an arm rising from the black surface the way a hand rises from very still water when someone below reaches upward, deliberate and certain and entirely without any suggestion of hurry, as though what was reaching had been in its position long enough to know exactly how far it needed to go. It reached for him, and the boy had time, a still moment of the kind that dreams sometimes extend well past its natural length. He had time to understand what was happening before the hand closed around him, and then the hand did close, and the surface received him and closed behind him, and the room was very quiet. The wooden lid rested where the boy had left it against the altar wall, Haruto observed, and the Shimenawa hung in its old loops, and the paper lantern near the entrance swayed, once in an air that had shifted, and then was still, and there was nothing else to see. That was how the story ended, Haruto told them. Not with a revelation about what the plate had been, not with any explanation of what lay behind it, not with an accounting of what had become of the boy. Simply an ending, a quiet arrival at the place the story had been moving toward from the very beginning. Someone in the classroom asked, as someone always did, what the plate had been and what had made it and what was waiting on the other side, and Haruto considered the question in his mild and thoughtful way, and then replied that the story did not say, that the only ones who knew were whoever had made the plate and sealed the lid and placed the Shimenawa over it so carefully, and the boy, and whatever had been waiting. And none of these were in any position to answer. The room stayed quiet for a moment, and then someone shifted in their seat, and someone else said something, and the quiet broke gently the way it always broke after one of Haruto's stories. Not with relief exactly, not with laughter, just with the ordinary sound of people returning to the ordinary world, which was still there waiting where they had left it. But Kenji sat still for a moment before joining that return, and what stayed with him, what he would still remember many years later, a little uncertain why it had stayed when so much else had not, was not the arm, and not the vanishing, but the slow counting of centimeters, the nightly increment, the patience of whatever had been behind that plate. There is something in a thing that does not hurry, he would come to feel over the years, that is more difficult to set aside than something that frightens you all at once. A thing that moves in fractions so small that each morning you wake and find only the thinnest addition to what was already there, and yet the fractions accumulate, and keep accumulating as fractions will. That, he thought, was what Haruto had given them. Not a monster, not exactly, but the feeling of something measuring itself in degrees so small they could almost be mistaken for the passage of ordinary time. Except that ordinary time did not move with such clear direction. They filed out of the classroom as the school building settled into the quiet of an early autumn evening. The air outside just barely cooler than the summer still ending. And the walk home was ordinary and familiar, and the meal was warm, and the house was as it had always been. Kenji lay in his futon that night and looked at the ceiling, and the ceiling was plain and close, and sleep came the way it always did at 12, without ceremony, without any particular announcement, simply arriving when he stopped looking for it. But in the soft place between waking and sleep, where the day's shapes dissolve and the nights have not quite arrived, he found himself thinking about fractions, about how many nights are in a summer, about how small a movement can be and still, given enough nights, come to mean something, about what it might feel like to arrive each night at a place and find the work already slightly further along than where you left it. He thought of a plate that was dark all the way through, and a voice repeating the same two patient words across however many nights the counting took, and a lid tilting a little further each morning. All those small degrees adding up, slowly, without drama, in the ordinary dark of sleeping houses, while the rest of the world was not paying attention. And that, perhaps, is where this part of the story rests for tonight. In the quiet arithmetic of small things, in the patience of something that needs no rush, in all the nights that carry a lid from closed to open a little at a time, until the night arrives at last that was always going to come. Let that moment rest where it is quiet and still, the way the last light of a candle rests before it finally fades. We stay with them a little longer in the same darkness, in the same gentle unfolding of that night, and there is no hurry at all. Take a slow breath if you like. Let your shoulders soften. Let your eyes grow heavy. The story has not ended. It has only paused, the way a river pauses in a wide, unhurried bend before it continues on, smooth and deep, and carrying everything forward without effort, without sound. When you are ready, we go on together into the next quiet hour. In the slow, mild light of a September afternoon, a boy named Kenji made his way out of the school building alongside his classmates, Haruto's story still with them, still settled somewhere inside the chest, the way a certain kind of music lingers after the last note has already passed. Nobody said very much as they came through the gate, and this was unusual because after one of Haruto's stories, the walk home was normally its own small celebration. Everyone talking at once about the parts that had unsettled them, competing gently over who had felt the most afraid, who had caught the cleverest detail. This evening was quieter in a way that was hard to name exactly. So Kenji simply walked with his bag over one shoulder and listened to the sound of the September street and let the feeling be whatever it was. The story itself had been very good, a very good one, in the way that Haruto's best ones always were: the small boy visiting his grandparents in the countryside, the shrine at the top of the little hill at the edge of town, the wooden lid found around back, ancient and charred on its underside, and then the metal plate inside the shrine that would not move, that would not move, that would not move until the dreams began. And Kenji had found himself leaning forward during the telling, the way you do when something is working on you properly, his elbows on the desk, his chin near his hands, and he was not the only one. The whole room had leaned in that way. That quiet, collective leaning that happened without anyone deciding it should, as though the room itself understood what was occurring and made space for it. At the corner where four of them went different ways, they stopped and talked about the metal plate, what it might have been, what it might have been covering, what existed on the other side of something like that. Someone said it was probably a mirror that showed you a version of yourself you were not supposed to see, and someone else said it was probably a gateway of some kind, and a third voice said it was maybe something that had no name in any language, which felt in some ways like the most honest answer any of them could offer. They talked for a few minutes, and then the corner did what corners do and broke them apart, and each of them went home along their own street, and the September evening settled softly around the city. Kenji sat at dinner that night, and his mother asked if something was wrong, and Kenji said that nothing was wrong because in every way he could describe to her, nothing was. He ate his rice and listened to the ordinary sounds of the evening, the television murmuring from the next room, the neighbor's door somewhere above, the faint passage of traffic along the main road. And he tried to find a name for what he was carrying, this small stone that had settled in his chest sometime during the walk home, and could not find one. So he left it unnamed and went to sleep without it troubling him very much. If he dreamed that night, he had forgotten the dream by morning. The next day, when Kenji arrived at school, Haruto's seat was empty. This was not by itself alarming. Haruto had only just come back from a full week of illness at the very start of term, and the desk simply held his absence in the placid way that empty desks do, waiting for the obvious explanation to arrive and fill it. Kenji assumed he would be back the next morning, and the day passed with the ordinary texture of a school day in early autumn. The warmth not quite gone, the windows open, the chalk smell drifting together with the cut grass scent that came from somewhere beyond the fence. But the next morning, the seat was empty again, and the morning after that. By the fourth morning, something in the classroom had shifted, not dramatically, not in any way that Kenji could point to, but in the way a familiar room shifts when one habitual sound has simply stopped, and the absence of that sound sits heavier than ordinary silence. Nobody discussed it openly, and this was itself a kind of speaking The particular care they all took not to mention it, the way they would each glance briefly at the empty desk during the morning register and then look away again, back at their notebooks, back at the board. Kenji would find himself looking at Haruto's desk, sometimes during the long afternoon lessons, when the teacher was writing and the class was supposed to be copying, and he would think about the way Haruto's hands moved slightly when he was in the middle of a story. Not dramatically, just a small movement, as though the story had a physical shape he was feeling his way around in the air. He thought about the glasses, always slightly too large for Haruto's face, always sliding slowly down, and the way Haruto would push them back up with one finger, quietly, in the middle of a sentence, without ever losing the thread. He thought about the particular hush that Haruto's beginnings called into being. The way a room full of ordinary, restless children could become perfectly still without any instruction, just because Haruto had started. And then he thought about the lid story, and the small stone returned to its place in his chest, and he looked back at his notebook. After about a week of the empty desk, a group of them, Kenji and 4 or 5 others, waited until after the afternoon classes and went to find the teacher. She was at her desk with a stack of papers and a red pen, and she looked up when they filed in, and something in her expression shifted very slightly, almost too slight to read, as if she had been expecting someone to come, or someone very much like them. They told her, as politely as 6th graders could manage, that they were concerned about Haruto, that he had been gone for quite a long time now, and that they would very much like to go and pay him a visit. The teacher set down her red pen. She was quiet for a moment in the way that adults are quiet when they're choosing their words carefully, and Kenji stood near the door and listened to the sounds of the school buildings settling around them, a distant corridor sound, someone far away, the small noise of a September afternoon coming through the open window behind her. And then she shook her head slowly and told them that things were a little difficult at Haruto's home right now, and that it would probably be better if they did not go to visit, at least for the time being. A difficult time, she said, and she said it gently and carefully, in a way that closed the subject without slamming it. Nobody thought to press her further, or perhaps they thought to ask but understood, without quite knowing how, that an answer more specific than this one was not available to them. Not yet, not from her. They filed out of the classroom one by one, and Kenji was the last to leave, and he paused for a moment in the doorway and looked back, and the teacher had already returned to her papers, the red pen moving again in its quiet business, and she did not look up. In the hallway, the 5 of them walked toward the school gate without speaking, their footsteps on the wooden floor making what felt to Kenji like slightly less sound than there should have been, as if one set of steps was missing from the count. Then, gradually, the theories began, the way theories always do when there is a space that needs to be filled. Someone wondered if it was a hospital sort of difficulty, the kind that required quiet rooms and machines and careful adult voices, and whether Haruto had perhaps pushed himself too hard on the day he came back from his first illness. Someone else said that Haruto had always seemed slightly separate from ordinary things, not unkindly, just self-contained in a way that was specific to him, and perhaps that had always meant something that none of them had properly understood. A third voice offered that it was probably just an extended cold the lingering kind, and that Haruto would be back next week looking embarrassed about all the attention, and they would give him a hard time about it, and then everything would go back to normal. Kenji did not say anything and walked and let the theories move around him like weather. He was thinking, not clearly, not in words exactly, but in the way you think when something is at the edge of your mind and has not yet resolved itself into language, about the story, about the lid story, and about a feeling that had been with him since the afternoon Haruto had told it. There was something somewhere in the telling, some small detail that had been slightly different from all the other times, and the feeling of noticing it without being able to name, it was like the feeling of arriving in a familiar room and finding one object placed at a slightly different angle. Not wrong enough to explain, just enough to catch your eye and hold it. He walked home past the narrow lane where someone had grown tomatoes in pots along the outside wall all summer, and the tomatoes were still there, deep and heavy on their stems in the September afternoon, and a gray cat was sitting among them, considering its own private thoughts. Kenji stood for a moment at the corner and looked at the tomatoes, and the unnamed feeling settled a little lower and a little quieter, the way feelings sometimes do when you stop trying to force them into a shape they are not ready to take. He went home and sat at the dinner table, and his mother asked if something was wrong, and he said nothing was wrong, which was almost entirely true in every way that he could measure from where he was standing. The following Monday, Haruto's seat was still empty, and the Monday after that, and the classroom had begun, in a quiet and collective way, to arrange itself around the absence, the way a group of people arrange themselves without noticing they are doing it, shifting to fill a space that should not need filling, making the gap less visible without making it less present. The teacher kept her papers and her red pen and her careful voice, and the September light kept going amber in the long afternoons, and the lessons continued, and no one mentioned Haruto by name in those weeks, which was strange because he had been spoken about constantly before. The stone in Kenji's chest remained where it had settled. Not sharp, not heavy, simply there. And he was beginning to understand that it was the kind of thing that did not dissolve on its own schedule, but on some other schedule he did not have access to. He thought sometimes on the walk home about what a difficult time might mean at someone's house, what the inside of that difficulty might look like, what it might sound like in the hallway when you came in, whether it was the kind of difficult that had doctors in it or the kind that had something else. And every time he thought about it for very long, his mind would find its way, gently and without intention, back to the lid story, to the metal plate, to the small boy who had gone back to the shrine because he could not help himself, because what had started as curiosity had become something that curiosity is not quite the right word for. He would think about the story, and then he would think about the teacher's expression when they had come into the room, that barely visible shift, and then he would think about the red pen moving again on the papers. And then he would think about something else, about dinner or the weather or the tomatoes along the wall, and the thinking would let him be. Those days had a quality to them that Kenji would later find very difficult to describe to anyone who had not been inside them. Not fear and not grief, though they shared some of the texture of both, but something more like standing just outside a room where something important is happening, hearing the murmur of it from where you are, but not the words, knowing that the room exists and that what is happening in it matters, and understanding that the door is, for now, not for you. The classroom kept its rhythms, and the tomatoes stayed red in the afternoon, and the gray cat kept its counsel, and somewhere Haruto was somewhere, and whatever was difficult was still being difficult. And those were the facts as they stood. Kenji walked home every afternoon and stood sometimes for a moment at the corner by the tomato pots and let the unnamed feeling do whatever it needed to do, and then went inside to dinner and said that nothing was wrong. The September evenings cooled a little more each week, the light arriving softer and leaving earlier, the quality of the afternoons shifting the way autumn afternoons do, slowly without announcing themselves, until one day you realize the summer is simply gone. And Haruto's desk stayed empty, and the small stone stayed where it was, and the teacher's words, "A difficult time. Please don't go for a visit," stayed in Kenji's memory with the particular persistence of words that are said carefully, that are chosen precisely because they reveal nothing while revealing that there is something to reveal. He would not have been able to say, in those weeks, what he was waiting for, only that there was a quality to the days that felt unfinished, like a sentence that has gone quiet before the last word. The nameless things stayed nameless, and the days stayed ordinary on their surface, and the leaves on the trees outside the school windows began, very slowly, without hurry, to consider the changes that were coming. And that is where those days rested, in the amber September light, in the empty desk, in the red pen on the papers, and in the small, patient, nameless weight of something that had not yet found its words. Let that moment rest where it landed, quiet and still. There's no need to hold on to it tightly. It will stay with you on its own, the way certain things do, settling slowly, like dust in a room where nothing has moved for a long time. We stay with them a little longer, watching the night continue its slow work around them, unhurried, unchanged. Take a breath now, if you like. Let your shoulders soften. Let your eyes close a little more. The story has not ended. It only turns the way a river turns without breaking, carrying everything gently forward into the same soft dark it has always known. Somewhere near the middle of September, on a warm afternoon when the schoolroom windows were still golden with the fading edge of summer, the homeroom teacher came in and said that Haruto, the boy the whole class had always called great for reasons that had seemed perfectly obvious to 11-year-olds, would not be returning for the foreseeable future, and then stood there quietly for a moment, the way people do when they have said a thing they themselves are still getting used to. What stayed with Kenji, years later and then years after that, was not the exact shape of the words so much as the silence that gathered in their wake. Not the sharp, sudden kind, not the silence of something snapping, but something slower and more encompassing, the way a calm liquid spreads across a surface without appearing to hurry, until it has reached every corner. Nobody moved at their desks, and the afternoon light lay across the floor in its warm rectangles. And somewhere down the hallway footsteps went past as they always did, unhurried and indifferent to the news that had just arrived in this particular room. The teacher stood at the front with her hands folded and her expression arranged into something trying to be neutral and not entirely managing it. And no one asked a question, because the questions that occurred to them in that moment were not the kind you could put into ordinary words, or perhaps in any words at all. For nearly 2 weeks before this afternoon, they had all been telling themselves the comfortable version of events. That Haruto was simply still unwell, that the illness which had already claimed a week of his late summer was making a longer, slower claim now. That a person who came back to school pale and somewhat quieter than usual after a summer of being sick had every good reason to need more rest. The comfortable version had done its work well enough, which is all you can ask of a comfortable version of events. Nobody had believed it particularly, but nobody had gone looking for something less comfortable to put in its place. The teacher's face that afternoon was not the face of the comfortable version, and when she said that his family was going through something difficult and asked them please not to show up at his door without warning, the comfortable version quietly finished. He had been missing, she explained in her careful voice, since the evening after he returned to school, since that particular afternoon when he had sat among them, pale and glad to be back, adjusting his glasses before he began, and told them the story about the lid. Lessons were canceled for the afternoon, and the students were sent home in clusters as a precaution. The teacher using that word in the mild, measured way adults use it when they want an extraordinary situation to sound as though it is still within the range of ordinary management. Kenji walked home with a group of classmates, none of them talking much, all of them moving through streets that looked the same as they always had but felt slightly different underneath, the way a room feels different when the furniture is unchanged, but something important about it has shifted in the night. The park near the school was where they had always gone for the kind of talking that needed open sky above it, and no particular destination. And so that was where they found themselves, 7 or 8 of them settling onto benches and railings and the raised edge of the flower beds, while the first street lamp came on somewhat prematurely at the far end of the path, as though it had not noticed yet that there was still some light left in the sky. The maple trees along the park's edge had only just begun to change, the new color arriving first at the very tips of the outermost leaves, and most of the canopy was still green, moving in the small, warm evening wind with the easy patience of something that is time. For a while they talked about Haruto the way you talk about someone who has been removed from your daily life without warning, picking up memories carefully, looking at each one before setting it somewhere safe, making sure it was still intact. Someone mentioned the doll story and the particular quality of the fear it had produced, not the crashing, obvious fear of a sudden loud noise, but something that crept in from the edges, that made you aware of ordinary objects in your own house in a new and slightly uncomfortable way. Someone else mentioned his glasses and the way he always adjusted them with one finger just before he began, not because they needed adjustment, Kenji had always suspected, but because it was a gesture of settling oneself, a small private signal that the time for talking was over and the time for telling had arrived. Kenji found himself just listening for a while, watching the others speak, and felt the weight of what they were collectively doing, which was the human thing of collecting small facts about a person and holding them carefully, as though the fact were the person himself, and keeping them close was a form of keeping him. There was a particular quality to the light in the park at that hour, a warmth that was still summer light, but also already something else, the kind of light that makes you feel without quite knowing why, that things are shifting in a direction they will not be shifting back from. It was when the conversation had slowed and the pauses between sentences had grown longer and more comfortable that the weight of what the teacher had told them settled into its full shape. Haruto had last been seen at the train station near the school on the very evening he returned, the day of the lid story, the day he had told them about the boy who had gone to the country shrine, found the old wooden lid, discovered the metal plate behind the altar, and could not stop dreaming about what the plate was covering. He had walked toward the station, the teacher understood, and then the record of him simply stopped, and the police had been involved for some weeks, and the words kidnapping is possible had apparently been spoken in some official room, though they sat strangely with everyone who heard them like a shoe on the wrong foot. Kenji said this aloud to the others, that Haruto had vanished on the very evening he told the lid story, and the park went quiet in the particular way it goes quiet when something has been said that the air itself seems to need a moment to absorb. Because there had been something since that afternoon. They all felt it now, and could see it recognized in each other's expressions. Something small and persistent and unnamed, a minor wrongness that none of them had been able to locate precisely. It had been there from the moment the lid story ended and the ordinary after-story conversation began, that faint, unplaceable feeling, like a sound that has stopped, but whose silence is somehow louder than the sound itself was. It was Mio who gave it its shape, or perhaps everyone gave it its shape at exactly the same moment. Kenji was never entirely sure afterward, and eventually stopped trying to determine it, because it seemed like the kind of understanding that belonged to all of them equally, rising from the shared experience rather than from any single mind. Haruto had not begun the lid story the way he had always begun his stories. He had not said, "This is a story I made up," but those words had simply not been there. 7 or 8 children in a park at the edge of evening, and all of them arrived at this at once, and none of them spoke for a long moment, and the wind moved through the maple trees above them in one slow wave, and then was still. The disclaimer, that careful, specific sentence which Haruto had once explained to them with such patient thoroughness. The sentence about the way belief accumulates weight, the way a story that many people genuinely fear can become something heavier and more present than a story. The sentence that was always the first thing he said precisely because of what it was preventing. That sentence had been absent from the one story that could least afford its absence. Kenji went back through his memory of that afternoon, replaying what he could of Haruto's voice, the rhythm of the beginning, and found it was true. The opening had been different, not in any way that would have announced itself in the moment, but in a way that was perfectly unmistakable from here, from the other side of knowing. The boy in the story, the one who had gone to visit his grandparents for the summer, who had found the old wooden lid behind the small shrine at the top of the hill, who had become so absorbed in the mystery of the metal plate behind it that the summer had disappeared, who had dreamed night after night of opening something that wanted very much to be opened. That boy had been Haruto. All of it had been real. The shrine on its small hill, the lid that was heavier than it looked, the photographs that came back blackened, the summer of dreaming, the voice at the end of the dream that said only one word, over and over, until it was the first thing he heard when he woke and the last thing before he slept. He had come back to school in September, still carrying all of it, not yet loose for whatever had its hold on him through those long weeks, and had done the only thing he knew how to do with something he needed other people to know. He had shaped it into a story and told it to them, in his careful, unhurried way, with all the same precision he brought to every invented tale he had ever shared. Without the disclaimer, Kenji sat with this for a while and noticed that what he felt was not straightforwardly fear, though something that lived very close to fear was present. He could sense it through the wall, as it were, but the room he was actually in contained something quieter and more complicated, something that did not have a word he knew. He found himself wondering whether Haruto had known, when he began the story, that he was going to go back to the shrine, whether the telling had been a kind of farewell, or a record left behind for people he trusted, or simply the only reliable means available to him for passing the truth of the summer to someone else. Because giving things the shape of stories was the language in which Haruto had always been most fluent, the one he trusted most to carry what needed carrying. There was something in that thought that was not only sad. A person made entirely of stories, giving the truest thing that had ever happened to him in the form he knew best, trusting the room with it the way he had always trusted the room. There was something almost fitting in it, almost appropriate, the way that the most consequential things sometimes feel, right even when they're also terrible. He had trusted them with it, and that trust had not diminished across all the years that followed. The park was fully dark now around the edges, and a single street lamp held its warm circle on the path below it, and the maple branches were only shapes against the last of the sky, and still none of them moved to leave. It was Daichi who finally put words to what the silence had been containing, quietly, in the tone that belongs not to questions but to things that have already settled and need only to be said aloud. That guy really was great. He observed softly and then let it sit. And that was true, and they all felt it as true, and the simplicity of the sentence was the right container for what they were feeling, which was too large and too strange for anything more elaborate. Haruto had been great in the literal, particular sense that only children can give a name. Great because he was more skilled at stories than the people whose job it was to teach stories. Great because he understood something about the relationship between language and belief and felt experience that most adults would not have been able to articulate. And great because a room full of children went quiet the moment he began, not from politeness, but from something far more genuine and involuntary than politeness, something closer to recognition. And the last thing he had done with all of that was turn it toward himself. His own summer, his own long obsession, the weeks alone with a metal plate and a recurring dream and a certainty that was slowly filling up all the available space in his mind. He had brought this to them in his careful, unhurried way, with the same precision and the same understated delivery he brought to every story he had ever told. And he had not said the opening words, because this time the opening words would have been untrue. And perhaps, and this was the thought Kenji found himself returning to years later, and then years after that, perhaps Haruto had needed someone else to hold a version of it, even a version dressed in story clothes. Because a person who has been alone with something very large for an entire summer is a person who has been very much alone, And there is a particular weight to that kind of solitude that wants, at minimum, to be witnessed. 20 years passed in the way that years do when you're living them from the inside, which is to say all at once, and somehow also without quite noticing. And Haruto was never found, and his family moved away not long after, and the name of the town and the shrine and the small hill became things that could not be confirmed because the person who had been to those places was gone. The old classmates found each other again occasionally, the way people from that particular age sometimes do, at a chance encounter on a train platform, or a deliberate dinner that someone organized one autumn, or a warm evening on a narrow balcony with something cold to drink, and the easy pleasure of talking about the past with people who were also inside it. And whenever this happened, at some point in the evening, someone would raise a glass toward the space at the table that belonged to no one in particular, and, in another sense, had always belonged to Haruto, and say simply, to great. And they would drink, and for a moment he was among them again as he had always been, not entirely frightening, not entirely ordinary, but something more complete and more interesting than either. The person in the room that everyone was a little more alert around, not from discomfort, but because his presence seemed to sharpen the air, to make the ordinary things around him feel slightly more worth attending to. The Lid story had stayed with them in a way none of his other stories had, and they all knew why, even if they did not often put it into words. It was the only one that was real, and it was the only one where the storyteller and the story were, in the end, the same person. What Haruto had done with that story was leave them something to carry, not the secret of the shrine, which would always be a secret, and not the answer to what lay behind the metal plate, which would always be an absence, but the shape of a particular kind of mind, the record that someone like this had existed and moved among them in a certain year of their shared childhood and trusted them with the things that mattered. A storyteller's lasting gift, perhaps, is not the story itself, but the fact that the story remains after the teller is gone, and the people who received it carry it forward into their lives, and set it down at tables, and raise it in small, sincere toasts on quiet evenings, and find that it has not gotten lighter with the years. The street lamp in the park burned through all of that September evening, and the maple trees went on turning through the weeks that followed, and somewhere a small shrine stood on its hill with whatever it held inside it, patient as it had always been, and none of that was knowable now, and perhaps was never meant to be. Haruto had been great, and that was what they kept, and that was the word that held everything else, and that, perhaps, is where his story rests for tonight. Let that moment rest now, just as it is, still and unhurried in the quiet around it. There is no need to hold on tightly. Let it soften the edges, the way a candle flame settles when the room grows still. The night has not moved on without you. The same darkness holds the same house, the same people breathing somewhere in it. And the story continues exactly where it was, only a little deeper now, a little further along the thread. If you need a breath, take one slowly. There is time. The hour is gentle, and whatever comes next arrives without urgency, carried on the same unhurried current that has brought you here. In a small izakaya somewhere in the east of Tokyo, on a wet October evening, when the rain had come in softly and without announcement, Kenji sat with the people who had once been his classmates and watch someone pour the year's first round of drinks. They were 40 now, most of them, or near enough. The kind of age where time announces itself most quietly in the hands of old friends, in the slight settling of familiar faces, in a way nobody quite moves at the speed they used to move without being fully aware of it. Someone had put a reservation in for 12, and all 12 had come, which was a better turnout than most years, and the narrow table felt warmly close with the paper lanterns overhead and the smell of the kitchen drifting through from somewhere behind. The izakaya was not a fancy place. Low wooden tables, laminated menus, a narrow corridor toward a kitchen where someone was saying something unhurried to someone else over the sound of oil. And this was, Kenji had always felt, entirely right for what they gathered here to do. Haruto would not have wanted anywhere fancier. There was a moment each year that all 12 of them seemed to understand without needing to discuss it. The moment when the first round had been poured and the glasses were in hand and the conversation at the table dropped, first to a murmur, then below a murmur, and everyone waited for someone to make the toast. This year it was Naoki who did it, standing slightly in the way Naoki always stood slightly when he felt something needed to be said, not grandly, not with ceremony, just with the quiet directness of someone who has earned the right to say the obvious thing plainly. He raised his glass toward the head of the table and said, simply, to great. And just like that, all 12 glasses went up, and a murmur moved around the table. To great, and everyone drank, and the silence that followed was the particular kind that only arrives after a toast to someone who is not in a room and has not been in any room for 20 years. Pause. Kenji turned his glass slowly in his hands after the toast, feeling the coolness of it, watching the small ring of condensation it left on the low wooden table, and thought, as he thought every year at exactly this point in the evening, about Haruto. Haruto, who had been 12 years old the last time any of them had seen him, walking away from school on an ordinary autumn afternoon with his bag over one shoulder, going in a direction that no one had thought to watch closely because there was, at that point, no reason to. Haruto, who had spent their shared elementary school years in the library, with his glasses sliding down his nose and a stack of books beside him that was always precisely too tall to be stable, reading detective novels and folklore collections with the same expression of mild and satisfied hunger. He had been, in the way of some children, genuinely remarkable, not for his grades, which were excellent but not unique, and not for his memory, though that was formidable, but for something harder to name, the ability to give a story exactly the weight it needed and then step back and let the weight do its work. Breath. The other children had given him a name, not an ordinary nickname, which children give each other constantly and without much care, but a title which is a different and more considered thing. They called him great because they respected him the way you only respect someone who is actually teaching you something, and because the name was simply accurate. Kenji remembered what it had been like being 10 or 11 years old and sitting in the back of the classroom on a Friday afternoon, feeling the air go completely and uniformly still the moment Haruto said the words he always said at the beginning. "This is a story I made up," Haruto would say, quietly without drama, looking at no one quite directly. And the classroom would go still in the way a classroom rarely goes still, which is completely and all at once. And then Haruto would begin, and the next 20 minutes would give everyone something to carry home. His stories were always about things that could not be seen and could not be verified and could not be cleanly explained away, but which arrived with such careful internal logic and such patience of detail that the explaining away felt, by the end, somewhat beside the point. Doll factories and crossroads, and figures seen at a particular hour in a particular quality of light. He had a vast and quiet inventory of the uncanny, and he shared from it with the generosity of someone who genuinely believed that interesting things were meant to be passed around. Pause. He had also once sat them all down and explained his careful way why he always began with that particular phrase, why it mattered specifically that the first words out of his mouth each time were, "This is a story I made up." Strong feeling, he told them, given freely by enough people who believed in a story, could attach itself to the story and make it real, could give it the weight of a true thing, the substance of something that had actually happened, the capacity to move in the world the way only real things can move. And so he told only stories he had invented. He explained so that the belief of his listeners would land on something he had made himself, something he could account for, something that could receive all that feeling without passing it anywhere it should not go. The classroom had been very quiet after that explanation. Kenji remembered, and the quality of the quiet was different from the usual Friday afternoon stillness. Cooler, slightly uncertain, the quiet of a group of children who have just been given information they were not entirely prepared to hold. Pause. And then there was the last story. It was the early autumn of their 6th year, the final year of primary school, and Haruto had been ill through the end of the summer and come back to class a week late. A little thinner than before, his glasses at a slightly different angle on his face, and everyone had been relieved to see him, in the indirect way that children express relief, which is through mild complaints about his absence. The story he told that afternoon was about a lid. A wooden lid, ancient and very heavy, found behind a small shrine at the edge of a country town, and a boy who followed the lid's mystery into a sequence of dreams that grew more insistent each night until the waking world felt less substantial than the dreaming one. It was by every measure they had ever applied to Haruto's stories, the finest he had ever told, the most patiently built, the most densely inhabited, the most inwardly convincing, with its rural hillside shrine and its dark wooden sanctuary, and the sound of something whispering from behind a surface that had no business making any sound at all. Long pause. Kenji had walked home that afternoon, carrying the particular chill that a very well-made story leaves behind. Pleasant in the way of a perfectly chosen word, almost aesthetic, almost admiring, but beneath the chill, barely noticeable, a smaller and less nameable feeling, like the sensation of having left the house without something and not yet being sure what it was. It was only the next day, when the teacher called them together with a careful expression and told them that Haruto had not come home, that Kenji understood what had been missing from the story. Haruto had not said at the beginning, "This is a story I made up." Pause. They were children, and they understood it the way children sometimes understand things, clearly, and in the open air, in a small park with a climbing frame and a sandbox, sitting in a row on a bench because there was nowhere else to sit and none of them wanted to go home while the understanding was still arriving. The boy in the story was Haruto himself. The country town was a real town. The shrine was a real shrine. The metal disc in the dark of the sanctuary was a thing that had actually existed, and the dreams had been real dreams that had grown more insistent each night until the waking world and the dreaming world had quietly exchanged their levels of conviction. He had gone back to the shrine. They understood, sitting in a row on a park bench in the fading afternoon, and whatever the metal disc had opened onto, whatever waited on the other side of that ancient lid in the dark of the small sanctuary on the wooded hill, had let him in. Breath. It was not a frightening conclusion, which surprised Kenji even at the time. It was more like a completing one, the kind of conclusion that makes a story feel finished in a way you had not known it needed to feel. They did not share this conclusion with anyone else, not because they decided to keep it secret, but because they understood without discussion that it would not be the kind of help that was needed, and that the people searching the sensible places, the train stations, the riverbanks, the edges of the city, were looking for something that a group of 12-year-olds in a park could not help them find. The search continued, and then continued in a quieter way, and then became the kind of search that is technically still open and practically something else, and Haruto's family moved away before the end of the school year, and the classroom arranged itself around the absence, as classrooms do, slowly, without announcement, and then all at once. Pause. 20 years had gone by. Kenji looked around the table at the people who had been 12 with him, who were 40 now, who had between them marriages and children and apartments and careers and the first gray at the temples, and who came back every October to this narrow izakaya, because some things, once started, simply continue. Yui, who had sat next to Kenji in class and had been afraid of nothing except spiders, was talking quietly to Daichi at the far end of the table, and Daichi was listening with the full attention of someone genuinely interested in what was being said, a quality he had always possessed even in primary school. Naoki was moving around the table with the second round, filling glasses with the ease of someone who had been doing this for many years, and when he reached the small glass at the head of the table, not formally designated as Haruto's glass, never formally anything, but understood by all 12 to be Haruto's nonetheless, he filled it carefully to the same level as the others. Breath. This was the other ritual. The glass filled at the empty seat. The seat that was empty every year and would remain empty for as long as any of them kept returning to fill it. Kenji found himself thinking, as he often did at this particular moment in the evening, about what Haruto would have made of the whole arrangement. The toast, the empty glass, the care with which 12 people in their 40s marked his continued absence, year after year, in the same narrow restaurant with the same paper lanterns and the same laminated menus. He thought Haruto would have found it exactly right. Not from vanity. Haruto had not been vain, not particularly, but because Haruto had always understood stories better than most people understand most things, and this was, by any measure Kenji could apply, a very good story. A boy who told ghost stories so well that in the end he became one, and whose last and finest story was the story of his own disappearance, which only became fully legible the day after he was gone. Pause. Someone at the far end of the table, Mio, Kenji thought, though the lantern light made it difficult to be certain. Said what someone said every year at roughly this point in the evening, in the same quiet and wondering tone. That was still the best ghost story he ever told, wasn't it? And everyone agreed, in the particular soft way you agree with something that is both obviously true and slightly too large for the room you're sitting in. Because it was, without sentimentality, without any need to romanticize what was in ordinary terms, simply the disappearance of a 12-year-old boy who had never been found. Genuinely the best ghost story Haruto had ever told. A story in which the teller walked into the dark center of his own telling and did not walk back out, and in which everyone who had been present for the original performance could say, with a complicated and quiet kind of pride, that they had been there, that they had heard it, that they had felt even then that something about that particular Friday afternoon was different from the others. Pause. Kenji thought about the small phrase that had been missing from that last story. This is a story I made up, and the way its absence had been the single wrong note in a performance that was otherwise perfectly tuned. He thought about what Haruto had explained, in his careful and unhurried way, about the idea that words given weight by enough belief could become real, that strong feeling, widely shared, attaches itself to a story and gives it the density of something that actually happened. And he thought that if that idea held any truth at all, then Haruto's last story had become, over the course of 20 years of telling and retelling, very real indeed. They gave it weight every time they gathered here, every time the toast was raised, every time someone at this table told the story to a partner or a friend who had not known Haruto and wanted to understand what the reunion was still about. And each telling made it slightly more solid, slightly more permanent, slightly more fixed in the world as a thing that had happened and would always have happened. Breath. The evening continued as evenings do in such places. The food came in small dishes. The conversation ranged through years and cities and things that had nothing to do with Haruto at all. And at some point Naoki told a story about his upstairs neighbor that made everyone laugh quietly into their drinks. But somewhere underneath the ordinary warmth of the gathering, that other thing was always present. The sense of Haruto's company that was not his company. The ghost of a chair that should not have been empty and had been empty for 20 years. Toward the end of the night, when the plates had been cleared and the glasses were nearly empty and the paper lantern above them swayed very gently in the warmth rising from the kitchen, Kenji looked at the glass at the empty seat and thought, simply and without grief, that he hoped it had turned out to be interesting. Pause. Whatever was on the other side of shrine on a wooded hill in a country town, whatever the metal disc had opened onto, whatever had been whispering from behind that ancient surface in the dark, he hoped it was the kind of thing that Haruto, specifically, would have found worth going toward. Because Haruto had always valued interesting above almost everything else, and had spent his childhood pulling interesting things from library shelves and then going to the further trouble of shaping them into a form that made other people feel the interest too, of sharing what he found rather than keeping it quietly to himself. And then, at the end, he had found something so interesting that he had gone toward it, even when going meant going somewhere the rest of them could not follow, through an old shrine on a hillside, into the autumn, into a story that had been waiting in the dark for precisely the right person to lean close enough to hear it properly. Long pause. That Kenji thought was perhaps the most Haruto thing that could possibly have happened. Someone settled the bill, and coats were put on, and the chair at the head of the table was pushed in carefully, and the small glass at Haruto's place was left as it was, the remaining drink catching the lantern light in a way that was not symbolic, and yet felt, despite everything, significant. They filed out into the October street one by one, and outside the rain had settled into something barely worth calling rain, a mist, really the kind that does not quite make you wet so much as remind you, gently, that the sky is present and close and paying its own soft attention to things. Pause. Kenji stood on the pavement for a moment after the others had turned toward the station and looked up at the narrow strip of sky between the buildings and said nothing, and thought about a boy with glasses and a too tall stack of books in an elementary school library 30 years ago, reaching without hesitation for the next thing that interested him. To great, he thought, in the private way of someone who does not need to say a thing aloud to fully mean it. And then he turned up his collar against the mist and walked toward the station, and the warm glow of the izakaya softened in the rain behind him, and the wet street held the reflection of it for a moment, briefly, and then the night settled back into itself and went on the way nights do, without fanfare, without needing anything more from anyone. Haruto had been missing for 20 years, and perhaps he would be missing for 20 more, somewhere on the other side of a shrine that no one had been able to find in a metal disc that no one else had ever touched. And perhaps wherever that was, it was genuinely interesting, and perhaps that was a kind of answer, or at least the closest thing to one that this story was ever going to offer. Pause. And every October, in a small izakaya in East Tokyo, 12 people raise a glass to make sure he knew they remembered, and to say, in a wordless language of raised glasses and warm rooms, that the story he had given them was still being carried forward, still being told, still being made slightly more real with each passing year and each new telling. That, perhaps, is where his story rests for tonight. And so, that is where tonight's story comes to rest. Like the last light fading from a paper lantern, it has given everything it had to give, and now it lets you go.